My father left me 50 acres of vines, a 100-year-old Victorian house, and a wine cellar full of bottles older than I was. He left me all of it because he loved me. What I didn't know, what no one told me, was that the moment his will was read, I became a target. My husband wanted the money. My brother wanted revenge. And both of them had been patient enough to wait 4 years before making their move. The night it all started, I was sitting at a wine bar in Napa, watching my husband hold my hand, and I could feel the trap closing. Then a stranger pressed a wooden box into my palm and disappeared into the dark. And everything I thought I knew about the people closest to me began to unravel. Rowan Clark's story is not just a thriller, it's a mirror. It reflects what family betrayal really looks like. Not a knife in the dark, but a slow, calculated erosion of trust from the inside out. The lesson this story carries: your inheritance isn't just property. It's everything your loved ones fought to build for you. Protect it. And more than that, protect yourself. Don't click away. The biggest revelation in this story comes when you least expect it. Hit like if this already has your attention. Leave a comment telling us what you think is in that box. Share it with someone who loves a good story. And subscribe, because we tell stories here that deserve to be heard. This content was manually researched, developed, and edited by our team to bring you meaningful stories with real lessons you can carry into your own life.
As a counselor, you hear stories that stay with you. One that I often come back to is Brandon's. When he first came to me, he spoke of a night in an elegant cafe with his wife Stephanie and her brother. He described watching his estranged father, a man he hadn't truly known for decades, slip a small walnut box into his wife's hands with a hushed warning. That was the moment, he told me, that his carefully constructed world began to fracture. Brandon recalled the drive home, the air thick with unspoken tension and his wife's guarded silence. He knew about the box she had hidden in her purse, and the secret it held felt like a ticking bomb between them. It's for stories like his that I do this work, and I'm grateful you're here to listen. If you feel comfortable, I'd love to see where this story reaches, so please feel free to share your city or country in the comments. I want to understand how far these lessons in human struggle can travel. It's important to state that while the specific details of this account have been altered to protect privacy, the emotional truth at its center is very real. That's the part I hope resonates with you, the part that you carry forward long after this story ends. The wine bar, he told me, smelled of oak and expensive wine, a perfect backdrop for the conversation that would set everything in motion. He remembered leaning across the table, trying to make his voice sound gentle. "Stephanie, honey," he'd said, "I hate seeing you so stressed. That vineyard is just too much for one person." He was performing a role he'd rehearsed 1,000 times with her brother. He described how Stephanie's hand tightened on her wine glass as she forced a smile. He reached out, covering her hand with his, hoping the gesture felt reassuring. In our sessions, he admitted it was a calculated move, meant to soothe and disarm. "You're an amazing teacher, not a corporate executive," he'd told her, a line fed to him by her brother. "Your dad left you Willow Creek Vineyard because he adored you," he'd continued. "But he never meant for you to carry it alone." He confessed to me the profound guilt he felt saying those words. He knew the vineyard wasn't just 50 acres of land. It was the last tangible piece of her father, the sanctuary he'd built after her mother passed away. And Brandon was the one chosen to convince her to sell it. $8.5 million, he'd said. the number feeling obscene and seductive at the same time. We could get a place on the coast, travel. We could finally have a life. When she pulled her hand away and repeated, "I'm managing," he felt the first real crack in his composure. He remembered the fleeting tension in his jaw before the mask of concern slipped back into place. "I'm just trying to help," he'd insisted, and across the table sat her brother Eric, silent and watchful. Eric, who was 10 years older and shared a father with Stephanie but not a mother, was the architect of this whole plan. Our father had left Eric $500,000 in cash 4 years prior, while Stephanie inherited the vineyard. Eric had squandered his share in under 2 years on failed tech ventures. Now, broke and desperate, he was using Brandon to get his hands on Stephanie's legacy. "Brandon's right," Eric had chimed in, his voice low and persuasive. "You're drowning in property taxes," Eric had pressed. "You're being sentimental and you'll lose it all." Brandon remembered how Stephanie's eyes flashed. "I'm being loyal." "To a dead man?" Eric had scoffed. That's when she stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, the sound echoing Brandon's own internal alarm. "I need some air," she'd announced, and as she walked out, a cold dread washed over Brandon. He knew his father, Frank, had been trying to get in contact to warn her. He stood, making a show of concern. "Stephanie, wait." But she was already gone, heading out into the cool October night. Through the window, he watched her cross the dimly lit parking lot. She always parked in the shadows, a habit she'd picked up after her father's death that used to comfort him. That night, it terrified him. He felt a knot of panic tighten in his stomach because he knew she wasn't alone out there. Then, he saw it. A figure emerged from the far side of the lot, a tall man in a denim jacket. It was his father, Frank. Brandon felt frozen, a spectator in the destruction of his own life. He couldn't hear what was said, but he could imagine the fear in Stephanie's voice. He watched as she backed away, her keys clenched in her fist, and saw his father step forward, hands raised in a gesture of peace. The distance felt immense, a physical representation of the emotional chasm that had opened in his marriage. He was too far away to stop any of it. Frank, he explained to me, was a ghost from a life he'd tried to forget. In his late 60s now, weathered and tired, but with an urgency in his eyes that Brandon recognized even from afar. He saw his father reach into his jacket and pull out that small, polished walnut box. He was offering Stephanie the truth. "He's gonna kill you." That's what Frank was telling her. Brandon knew it. He wasn't planning to physically harm her, he insisted to me, but Eric's plan involved having her declared incompetent if she wouldn't sell. It was a different kind of death, a destruction of her spirit and autonomy. Brandon watched his father hold out the box, a lifeline he himself should have offered. He imagined Stephanie's disbelief, her denial. "Why should I trust you?" she would ask. And Frank, a man who had abandoned his own son, was now the only one she could trust. He saw his father place the box on the hood of her car before melting back into the darkness. Just like that, he was gone again. Brandon's heart hammered against his ribs. He watched Stephanie snatch the box, jump into her car, and speed away, her hands shaking on the wheel. The black sedan that tailed her out of town, he confessed later, was Eric's idea. Just to scare her into signing, his brother-in-law had claimed. Brandon felt sick about it. Another layer of coercion, another betrayal he had silently co-signed. He described his helplessness, knowing he had unleashed forces he couldn't control. He learned later how she'd sped down dark country roads, gravel flying, trying to shake the car that was relentlessly following her. He pictured her terror, her isolation, and knew it was a direct result of his weakness, his inability to stand up to Eric. When he finally got home, the old Victorian house was blazing with light. He found Stephanie inside, her back pressed against the locked front door, her chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. The silence in the house was heavier and more damning than any accusation she could have leveled at him. She had turned on every single light, a desperate attempt to chase away the darkness he had brought into her life. He told me the kitchen glowed with an almost painful brightness, yet it couldn't penetrate the shadows of fear and suspicion that now filled their home. He didn't follow her in. He waited, giving her space, knowing she needed to face the contents of that box alone. He imagined her sitting at their kitchen table, her hands on that polished walnut, preparing herself for the truth she was about to uncover. Truth will prevail. 2024. That was the inscription on the box, a promise from a stranger. Inside, as he knew, she would find 3 items: a wedding band, a micro SD card, and a handwritten letter. Each one a piece of a puzzle that would dismantle her life. It was his wedding band. Brandon told me that giving it to his father was one of the hardest things he'd ever done. It was the symbol of his commitment, a promise he was actively breaking. He'd helped Frank rig the hidden compartment inside it. He explained the mechanism to me, a faint ridge inside the band that, when pressed, would twist the ring open. He had taken the most sacred object in their marriage and turned it into a vessel for his own deceit, a fact he was still struggling to reconcile. And then there was the letter. Tucked inside the ring, folded into an impossibly small square, was his father's confession. Brandon knew every word by heart. He had read it himself before giving it to Frank, and the shame had been a physical weight in his chest. "Dear Stephanie," it began in handwriting that was shaky but clear. "My name is Frank Caruso. I am Brandon's father." The letter went on to detail a lifetime of failure and regret, of alcoholism, of abandoning his wife and 3-year-old son. It was a confession, an explanation, and a warning, all rolled into one. It was the truth that would either save her or destroy them both. As a counselor, you sometimes sit with a story that lodges itself in your soul. Brandon's was one of them. He'd carried this fragile hope that he could salvage the relationship with his son, that the young man he once knew was still in there. Then came the night of September 23rd, 2022, a night that shattered everything. He was out late fixing a broken sprinkler head in the vineyard when he heard yells coming from the wine cellar. He crept down, concealing himself among the oak barrels, and witnessed a horror that would haunt him for the rest of his days. His son, Eric, and another man, Carter, were cornering a young vineyard worker named Daniel Sanchez. Daniel was pleading for his life, his voice echoing in the stone cellar. "Please," he begged, "I have a wife, a little girl." But Eric, his own son, raised a crowbar and brought it down on him, twice. Brandon told me he fumbled for his phone, his hands shaking so violently he could barely press record. He wanted to scream, to call the police, but a cold terror seized him. That was his boy, his son. Reporting him meant condemning him to a life behind bars. For 2 years, he lived in a self-imposed prison of denial. He told himself Eric must have been forced into it by his associate Vance. He clung to the idea that if he could just gather enough evidence, he could prove his son was a victim, maybe even cut a deal with the FBI. So he collected everything, secret audio files, pictures, videos, desperately searching for proof of coercion. But about 3 months ago, that hope evaporated. He overheard a call between Eric and Vance. He heard his son's voice cold and clear. "I'll handle Stephanie myself. A car accident, clean and simple. I get the inheritance, all of it. 8.5 million from the vineyard. Another 3 million from her life insurance. It's more than enough to pay Vance and build a new life with Melissa." In that moment, Brandon understood. His son wasn't a pawn. He was a predator. He told me, his voice breaking, "I knew then I couldn't save my son, but I had to save her. I failed as a father, but I won't fail as a man," he'd resolved. He couldn't stop thinking about Daniel Sanchez's little 2-year-old girl who would never know her father because of what Eric did. He refused to let that happen to another family. His final note was a desperate plea. "Contact FBI Agent Sawyer. The number is 415-555-0147. Give her this SD card. Testify. Please live. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you sooner. Brandon Miller." Stephanie, his daughter-in-law, said she had to read the letter 3 times before the words even began to register. Brandon was Eric's father. Eric had murdered a man, Daniel Sanchez, a husband and a father, and now he was coming for her. A wave of nausea hit her so hard, she had to shove her chair back and stumble to the kitchen sink, her hands gripping the porcelain edge so tight her knuckles turned bone white. The sickness passed, but the terror remained. She returned to the table on unsteady legs and picked up the small black SD card. Her laptop was still sitting on the kitchen counter from that morning. With trembling hands, she sat down, inserted the card, and a folder appeared on the screen, labeled with her name, Stephanie. It was filled with dozens of files. She right-clicked, checking the folder's properties: 47 audio recordings, 89 photographs, and 12 videos. A part of her wanted to snap the laptop shut, to throw the card away and pretend none of this was real. But she couldn't. Her finger hovered over the mouse before she finally clicked on the first video. The timestamp read September 17th, 2024, just 1 month ago. The video was grainy, shot from a hidden camera in what looked like a storeroom. Eric was there, talking to Carter, their voices slightly muffled but chillingly clear. "Vance called," Carter said. "The buyers are confirmed. 200 million, Thursday, October 19th, Oakland Port, Pier 47. Eric nodded. "Good. But we've got a problem." "Stephanie's getting suspicious," Eric continued. "She saw that delivery truck last week. If she pokes around..." Carter cut in. "Then we do what we did with Daniel." Eric didn't hesitate. "A car accident. Highway 29, mile marker 52. I'll snip the brake line Wednesday night. She'll be gone by Friday." The video cut out. Stephanie just sat there, frozen, her hands feeling like they were glued to the laptop as her vision swam. She couldn't feel her own legs. Eric was going to murder her. Not someday, but this week, Wednesday night, in just 2 days. She forced herself to click the next file. The timestamp was from the day before, October 15th, 2024. Brandon's face filled the screen, illuminated by a single lamp, his voice low and filled with an unbearable urgency. "Stephanie, if you're seeing this, it means you've read my letter. I know this is terrifying, but you have very little time. Tonight, at precisely 11:47 p.m., you must go to the wine cellar. The security system has a glitch. It creates a 3-minute blind spot when the camera feeds switch. That's your chance. Go to row 7. Find bottle 217, a Chateau Margaux in 1996. Turn the bottle clockwise," he instructed. 3 complete times. You'll see what to do next. Eric and Carter are using your vineyard for something much darker than you can imagine. The proof is down there, but you have to be quick. Trust FBI agent Sawyer. Her number is in the letter. She's been after Vance for 3 years. She will keep you safe. I'm so sorry, Stephanie. This is all I can do. Please survive. The screen went dark. She glanced at the time on her laptop. 11:32 p.m. She had 15 minutes. Her heart hammered against her ribs. There was no time to think, no time to call for help. If Brandon was right, if there was really a blind spot in the cameras, she had to go. Now! She grabbed her phone, jammed it into her pocket, and bolted for the cellar door. 11:47 p.m. 3 minutes to find row 7 before she was visible again. The wine cellar felt colder than she'd ever remembered, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and aging wood. She hurried down the steep stone steps, her hand sliding along the cold iron railing as her phone's light cut a path through the gloom. The single overhead bulb was weak, casting long, distorted shadows from the wine racks that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Her father-in-law had adored this place, spending countless hours cataloging his collection, talking about vintages and soil as if they were poetry. Standing there now, in the space he had so carefully built, felt like trespassing in a crypt. She shook off the feeling and focused. Row 7, bottle 217. The cellar was expansive, 30 feet long, packed with hundreds of bottles. She moved fast, her eyes scanning the labels. Row 1, row 2. Her breath plumed in the frigid air. Row 3, row 4. 11:48. Her heart pounded. 2 minutes remaining. Row 5, row 6. And finally, row 7. She stopped, the beam of her flashlight dancing across the bottles. Mostly local wines, Napa Cabernets and Oregon Pinots with a few French imports. She counted down the labels. 215, 210. Where was it? 11:49. 1 minute left. Her hands were trembling now. 213, 215, 216. There. Bottle 217, Chateau Margaux, 1996. The label was old, its edges peeling. A thick layer of dust covered the glass. Reaching out, she felt the cool surface beneath her fingertips. Brandon's voice echoed in her head. Turn it clockwise, 3 full rotations. She gripped the neck of the bottle and twisted. It resisted for a second, then turned with a low, grinding noise. It wasn't the sound of glass against wood. It was mechanical, deep within the wall. On the second turn, the grinding intensified, joined by a soft clicking sound like hidden gears engaging. On the third turn, a loud clunk echoed through the cellar, making her jump back, her heart leaping into her throat. For a long second, nothing. Then, a section of the stone wall behind the rack began to shift. She stared, completely frozen, as a panel designed to look like solid rock slid silently to the side, scraping against the floor. Dust and loose mortar trickled down as a narrow, dark passageway was revealed. A rush of cold air poured out, carrying a sharp, acrid smell of chemicals that burned her nose. She raised her phone, shining its light into the blackness. The passage was tight, maybe 3 feet across, with rough, ancient-looking brick walls. She recognized it instantly from local history books. It was a prohibition tunnel. Napa Valley was full of them, secret passages used for smuggling alcohol when it was illegal. But what could Eric be hiding down here? She edged closer. Every nerve in her body was screaming at her to run, to get out, to call the police. But Brandon's warning replayed in her mind. You have 3 minutes. She checked her phone. 11:50. The cameras were active again. She heard a faint mechanical whir from above as the system switched feeds. But she was already in the tunnel, beyond the camera's view. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the darkness. The passage was so narrow and low she had to hunch over, running one hand along the damp brick to keep her balance. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. Her phone's light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, only showing a few feet in front of her. The chemical smell intensified the deeper she went, a sharp odor that burned the back of her throat. It smelled of ink, of solvents, and something else she couldn't place. After about 50 feet, the tunnel opened into a much larger space. She paused at the entrance, sweeping her light across the area, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The chamber was enormous, at least 30 by 40 feet, with a high, vaulted ceiling held up by thick wooden beams. It looked like it had been carved directly out of the bedrock, but it wasn't the room itself that stunned her. It was the contents. In the center of the space sat a massive industrial offset printing press, its steel frame looking sinister in her flashlight's beam. This wasn't something you found in a wine cellar. It belonged in a professional printing facility. Next to it were huge stacks of special paper. Her stomach dropped as she realized what it was. It was a cotton linen blend, the exact type used for printing United States currency. Shelves along the wall were crowded with bottles of chemicals, inks, solvents, and fixing agents, all neatly labeled. And then she saw them. Pallets stacked high with shrink-wrapped bundles of $100 bills, ready for distribution. Fake $100 bills, millions of them. When Brandon first spoke about the operation, he didn't describe it with pride, but with a kind of numb awe, like a man describing a tidal wave. He talked about millions of dollars in counterfeit bills, a fortune built in secret. He remembered walking through the underground chamber, the cold concrete floor unsteady beneath him, and seeing the ledger that tracked it all. It was his handwriting, small, precise, a chilling record of dates, quantities, and coordinates, all for a man he only knew as Petrov. He recalled one entry in particular, the one that sealed his fate. It read, Nikolai Petrov, total production, $47 million, 36 months. A new shipment was scheduled for October 19th, 2024, leaving from Oakland Port, Pier 47. $200 million, he told me, his voice barely a whisper, all set to go in just 4 days. He said his hands would tremble just thinking about the numbers, the sheer audacity of it all. There was no escape, no signal to the outside world from that deep. In his mind, he could see his wife, Stephanie, down there, snapping pictures of the press, the chemicals, the pallets of cash, evidence that would destroy him. He pictured her hands shaking, her desperation to capture the truth. The irony wasn't lost on him. As he stood there that night, he felt a different kind of tremor, a premonition of footsteps that would end his world. The sound he imagined was faint at first, an echo in the tunnels of his mind, not his own footsteps, but hers. He knew there was another entrance, another way in. Voices followed, and the panic he described wasn't about being caught, but about the conversation he was about to have. He was down there with his partner, Eric, and the walls were closing in. He had to hide a part of himself, not his body. He remembered Eric's nervous voice cutting through the silence. Told you she's been asking questions? What if she finds this place? And his own chilling reply, a mask of calm he no longer felt. Relax. She's probably asleep by now. You're paranoid. But Eric was right. I'm not paranoid, his partner shot back. I'm careful. Brandon knew the distinction had ceased to matter. They were less than 20 feet from the point of no return. There was no air duct for him to escape into, only the suffocating reality of his choices. He described the chamber not as a hiding place, but as a tomb. The air was thick with the smell of ink and deceit. The crates, stamped with Cyrillic letters he understood all too well, felt like coffins stacked and waiting. He didn't need to drag a crate. He was already trapped. He felt as though he was pulling his own soul upwards, straining against the weight of his actions, trying to squeeze through an impossibly narrow gap back to a life he had lost. The metal of his resolve was cold and dark, offering no comfort, only confinement. He told me he and Eric stepped into the chamber that night, and he felt a strange sense of ownership and dread. He surveyed the room, the source of his wealth and his ruin, like a king inspecting a crumbling kingdom. He was no longer hiding from his wife. He was watching her in his mind's eye, imagining her pressed flat against cold metal, witnessing his final betrayal. He saw Eric move to the desk, flipping through the ledger that contained their shared sins. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting their faces in harsh, unforgiving shadows. Brandon felt trapped in that moment, the air thick with dust and the unspoken truth of what had to be done. His phone was in his pocket, but it wasn't photos that burned against his thigh. It was the weight of his affair with Jessica. He remembered Eric's voice, artificially steady, confirming the schedule. Everything's on track. Petrov called an hour ago. The buyers are confirmed. The words echoed in the stone chamber, each one a nail in Stephanie's coffin. 200 million Thursday night. Oakland port, Eric had said. Brandon nodded, the motion feeling mechanical, detached. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture of a stressed husband that he had perfected. The plan was solid. A truck, a container leaving at midnight. By the time anyone noticed, the money would be halfway to St. Petersburg, Russia. It had started so much smaller, but now it was an international web, and he was caught deep within it. Then Eric leaned against the desk, his arms crossed, and Stephanie, just her name hanging in the air, felt like a judgment. Brandon felt a familiar tightening in his jaw. "She's becoming a problem," he'd said, the words tasting like poison. "I told you she'd refuse to sell." He confessed to me that, for a moment, he genuinely believed he could manage her. A toxic kind of hope. "I thought I could convince her," he recalled saying. "Play the concerned husband long enough, and she'd give in." But he knew it was a lie. She was stubborn, principled, just like her father had been, a man Eric dismissed with a snort. Michael was a pain in the ass, too. The memory of them talking about his father-in-law, a good man, as a mere inconvenience, still haunted him. "Stephanie's not gonna sell," he announced to Eric, the finality of it echoing off the concrete, which means we move to Plan B. Eric straightened up. "You sure? That's a big step." It was the only step left, and Brandon knew it. "If she starts digging," he explained, the logic cold and sharp, "if she talks to the wrong people, this whole thing falls apart. Petrov won't hesitate to kill us both. You know that." Eric fell silent. Then, the inevitable question, "What do you want to do?" Brandon didn't answer right away. He walked over to a pallet of counterfeit bills, the product of his broken morality. "The same thing we did with Mark," he said, and felt the temperature in the room drop. Mark, the cellar worker. He saw Eric shift, the memory still raw. "Brandon, you remember?" His voice was calm as he recounted it, a defense mechanism against the horror. September 2022. Mark was working late. He saw something he shouldn't have. He described the memory to Eric as if it were a scene from a movie. Mark following someone, finding the press. He was going to call the police, Brandon said, remembering the weight of the crowbar in his hand. He mimed the motion for Eric, a grotesque pantomime of murder. First hit, he went down. Second hit, he stopped moving. He told me he could still feel the phantom impact in his bones. He laid out the chilling efficiency of the cover-up. Detective Hayes buried it as a workplace accident. A fall from a ladder. No autopsy. The case was closed in 48 hours. Petrov had paid the detective $87,000. And you want to do the same with Stephanie? Eric had asked, his voice strained. Not the same, Brandon replied. Different method. He pulled out his phone, the plan already fully formed in his mind. Tomorrow night, 8 p.m. I'll tell her I want to apologize, that we need to talk. The words were a script he had rehearsed. I'll suggest a drive up Highway 29. Mile marker 52. There's a sharp curve there, a steep drop. Eric understood immediately. Brake failure. Exactly. I'll cut the brake line before we leave, he detailed. The plan spilling out with horrifying clarity. By the time we hit that curve, she won't be able to stop. A car over the embankment, a grieving husband who barely survived. He watched Eric stare at him, a flicker of something, fear, awe, in his eyes. You've really thought this through, Eric breathed. I've had 2 years to think about it. He put his phone away, the decision now concrete. Ever since Mark, he confessed, I knew eventually Stephanie would become a problem. With her gone, he would inherit everything. The vineyard, the house, a $3 million life insurance policy. He'd sell the property to one of Petrov's shell companies and disappear with a $2 million kickback. Costa Rica or Thailand? A place without extradition. Eric's final question was about Jessica. A slow, cruel smile spread across Brandon's face as he answered. Jessica comes with me. She's already filed for divorce. The plan was perfect. By the time Stephanie's funeral was over, they'd be gone. He admitted to me that, in that moment, he felt nothing but a hollow sense of relief. He checked his watch. Come on, he told Eric. We need to get back upstairs. They moved toward the second tunnel, the one Stephanie wouldn't have known about. Brandon flipped the switch, plunging the chamber and his entire life into darkness. The clang of the heavy metal door was the sound of his last chance shutting forever. After that, he said, there was only silence. He didn't stay frozen in a duct. He walked calmly back into his life, his heart beating a steady, traitorous rhythm. He counted the minutes, not in fear, but in anticipation. His legs weren't cramping, but his soul was. He didn't dare stop moving forward with the plan. His legs were steady as he climbed out of their secret world. The chamber was dark, but he knew the way. He didn't run, he walked, his steps measured and deliberate. The tunnel didn't feel longer. It felt like the final stretch of a race he had to win. He didn't stumble. His breath was even, his resolve absolute. When he reached the wine cellar, he closed the hidden door behind him, the grinding gears a familiar, comforting sound. He didn't bolt up the stairs. He ascended them slowly, walked through the kitchen, and went to his bedroom. He didn't collapse. He stood by the door, watching his wife sleep, feeling a profound and terrifying emptiness. His phone was in his hand, its screen dark. He knew what he was going to do. Tomorrow night, 8 p.m. He had less than 24 hours to become a widower. He looked at Stephanie's phone on her nightstand, a silent black rectangle. never imagining it held the one number that would unravel everything. The number for an FBI agent, a name burned into her memory from a letter her father had left her. 415-555-0147. He pictured her thumb hovering over the call button, and for the first time, he felt a flicker of genuine fear. He had killed Mark. He was about to kill his wife. What choice did she have? In my years as a counselor, I've found that true fear has a texture. Brandon described it to me as the feeling of ice water in his veins. He knew his wife was going to have him killed, and if he didn't make that call, Friday would be his last sunrise. He told me he took a deep breath and hit the dial. His hand was shaking so violently he almost fumbled the phone. Huddled on his bedroom floor with his back against the door he'd locked just moments before. The only sound in that sprawling house was the groan of the old foundation and the frantic drumming in his chest. He just kept thinking, please answer the phone. 3 rings felt like an eternity. What if Eric gave him a bad number? What if this was all a dead end? Then, a click. Agent Miller, organized crime. The voice was composed, professional, and blessedly calm. It was a woman's voice, one that carried an authority that immediately settled something in him. It was the sound of someone who had heard it all before and knew precisely the next step. Brandon told me he tried to speak, but his throat had seized up. "Hello?" Agent Miller said again. "Is anyone on the line?" He finally managed to push the words out. "My name is Brandon Clark." They were ragged, barely a whisper. "Eric Mitchell told me to contact you. My wife is planning my murder." A beat of silence followed, and in that space, all his fears rushed back in. Then, she said, "Mr. Clark, we've been expecting your call." The relief, he said, was like a dam breaking inside him. He nearly collapsed with it. She knew. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't alone. "Eric reached out to us 3 weeks ago." Agent Miller's tone softened, but it lost none of its seriousness. "He gave us some preliminary information about your wife's business dealings. We've had Stephanie Clark and her associates under surveillance since then. But we needed more. We needed you." "She's going to kill me tomorrow," he choked out, the words catching in his throat. 8 p.m. Highway 29, mile marker 52. She's paying someone to tamper with my car's brakes to make it look like an accident." "How are you certain of this?" she asked. So he told her everything. He described the small wooden box Eric had passed to him, containing the micro SD card, the hidden wine cellar, the secret tunnel, and the whole counterfeiting setup. $47 million in counterfeit currency, the industrial press, the ledger with Volkov's name in it. And then he told her about that night, how he'd hidden in a ventilation shaft, listening to Stephanie and Sterling plot out the final details of his death below. Agent Miller never once cut him off. He could hear the rapid, quiet tapping of keys, a comforting sound that told him every single word was being recorded. When he was finally done, the silence on the line was heavy. "Mr. Clark," she said at last, "you've given us invaluable evidence." "The memory card Eric gave you," she asked. "Do you have it with you?" "Yes, it's safe in my laptop. I also managed to take pictures of the printing press, the money, all of it." "Excellent. Don't touch anything on that card. We'll handle it when you get here." "Get there?" he repeated, confused. "Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. FBI field office in San Francisco on Golden Gate Avenue. I'm sending the address to your phone now. Bring the SD card, your phone, anything Eric gave you." He remembered nodding, a useless gesture over the phone. "Okay." "Brandon," Agent Miller's voice sharpened then, a sudden intensity beneath the calm. Listen to me. You cannot tell a soul about this conversation. Not Stephanie, not your friends, not your family. Absolutely no one. If Stephanie gets even a hint that you know, she'll just move up the schedule. You won't make it to tomorrow. The knot in his stomach tightened. What should I do? Behave as you normally would. Go to sleep. Get up at the same time. If she speaks to you, be cool and reserved, just like you've been since you first grew suspicious of her business. Give her no reason to believe anything has changed. But what if she suspects? He couldn't bring himself to finish. We will have a surveillance team outside your residence starting at 6 a.m., she said. They'll be in plain cars, posing as city workers. You won't notice them, but they'll be there. If Stephanie tries anything before you leave for the city, they will move in. He tried to find comfort in her words. He wanted to feel that shield of safety, but the image of Stephanie in that cellar, casually discussing how to sever his brake line as if she were deciding on dinner, was burned into his mind. "What happens when I get to the field office?" he asked. "You'll be debriefed, we'll analyze the evidence, and then we will move to execute arrest warrants for Stephanie, Sterling, and their entire crew. But we need your official testimony first. It's what makes the evidence stick. Without you, her lawyers could claim it was all fabricated." He felt the crushing reality of her next words. "You are our primary witness, Brandon. You're the one who ensures this case holds." The responsibility felt immense, suffocating, a key witness. His words would put the woman he had loved in prison for the rest of her life, the woman who had ordered the death of a man named Daniel Ramirez and was now planning his own. "I'll be there," he promised. "Good. I'll see you at 9. Agent Miller paused for a moment. "Brandon, I can only imagine how terrifying this is, but you did the absolute right thing. You are going to get through this. I give you my word." He clung to that promise. "Thank you," he whispered. "Try to get some sleep. We'll see you tomorrow." And then the line was dead. He told me he sat there for what felt like an hour, the phone still pressed to his ear, before setting it down. Agent Miller had told him to act normal, to go to bed. But how could he possibly sleep, knowing the woman in the room down the hall was finalizing plans for his murder? He somehow found the strength to get to his feet. His entire body was vibrating with a mix of pure fear and adrenaline. He got into bed without changing, pulling the covers right up to his eyes. The only light came from the red glow of the alarm clock on his nightstand. 1:47 a.m. He watched the ceiling, and every normal house sound became a direct threat. The groaning wood, the wind against the glass, a floorboard creaking. Was that her? Was she coming for him now? Did she know he'd been in the cellar? That he'd just gotten off the phone with the FBI? He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing slow, deep breaths. 6 a.m. That was his lifeline. The agents would be there at 6. Just over 4 hours to go. He must have dozed off, because he snapped awake with a jolt, his heart pounding against his ribs. The clock now read 3:02 a.m. A noise had woken him. Something close. Lying perfectly still, he strained to listen. And then he heard it again. The low rumble of a car engine right outside his house. He slipped out of bed, moving with a stealth he didn't know he possessed, and crept toward the window. He carefully lifted a corner of the curtain. A dark sedan was parked at the curb, maybe 30 feet away. Its lights were off, but he could see the faint glow of the taillights. There was someone in the driver's seat, and he saw the small, glowing orange tip of a cigarette. They were just sitting there, watching. His breath hitched. Was this Stephanie's doing? Or was this someone from Volkov's organization making sure he stayed put? The car idled for an eternity that was probably less than a minute. His fingers were clenched so tightly on the curtain that they started to ache. Suddenly, the headlights flashed on. The car eased into reverse, backed quietly down the block, and then vanished. He let the curtain drop, stumbling back toward the bed, his legs like jelly. Somebody was watching his house, and that was a terrifying new variable. He never went back to sleep. By 7 a.m., he was dressed and ready to go, his hands still trembling as he grabbed the SD card and his phone. He tried to rationalize the car, a neighbor, someone lost, but he knew that was a lie. He knew with a cold certainty that he had been watched. He slipped out the back door, not wanting to risk Stephanie seeing him from their bedroom window. His old Subaru was sitting in the driveway, slick with morning dew. He got in, locked the doors immediately, and peeled out onto the street. The 90-minute drive to San Francisco felt like it passed in a blur. The entire time, his eyes were glued to the rear-view mirror, half expecting to see that black sedan. Every car that got behind him sent a fresh jolt of panic through him. By the time he found parking near the FBI building on Golden Gate Avenue, his knuckles were white from gripping the wheel. It was an imposing structure of concrete and glass, with only a small federal seal by the door. Walking through the revolving doors, he approached a security desk, where a serious-looking guard checked his driver's license and made a quick phone call. "Mr. Clark," the guard said, "someone is on their way down for you." He waited in the cold, quiet lobby until an elevator door slid open and a woman emerged. Agent Miller looked exactly as he had pictured. Late 40s, short, no-nonsense gray hair, and piercing eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She wore a professional dark blazer, her badge fastened to her belt. "Mr. Clark," she said, offering a hand. Her handshake was firm, reassuring. "Thank you for making the journey." He could only manage a nod. She guided him into the elevator and up to the fourth floor, then down a long corridor of identical closed doors until they reached a conference room. A man was already inside, sitting at a table with a laptop. "This is Agent Logan," Miller explained as she shut the door. "He's our forensic tech expert." Logan, a man about 40 with salt and pepper hair and thin glasses, looked up from his screen and gave a slight nod. "Mr. Clark," he said, his voice low, "I'm sorry for what you're going through." Brandon wasn't sure what to say to that, so he just nodded and took a seat. Agent Miller sat opposite him, her hands clasped on the table. "I know this is incredibly difficult," she began, "but I need you to walk us through it from the very beginning. Tell us about the box." And so he did. He told them about Eric finding him in a parking garage, pressing a small wooden box into his hand that held a ring and the SD card. He explained the letter Eric had written, revealing who he was. He described finding the hidden passage in the wine cellar, the massive counterfeiting operation, and the pallets stacked high with $47 million in fake currency. And finally, he recounted hiding in the dark, listening as his wife and her partner finalized the plan to end his life. I remember when Brandon recounted this moment to me in our sessions. He described how the agents, Miller and Davis, shared a silent, heavy look. "This is it," Davis said, his voice low, as he took the memory card from Brandon's shaking hand and slid it into his laptop. As the computer chimed, Brandon told me it felt like the start of the end. A folder popped up, filled with 47 audio files, 89 photos, and 12 videos. Davis looked at Miller, This is more than enough to put Eric away for murder, counterfeiting, conspiracy, a whole laundry list of felonies. Agent Miller then turned to Brandon. Mr. Hayes, you've given us the weapon we need, but we still need you to pull the trigger, so to speak. Your testimony is crucial. You saw it all. You heard Eric confess to killing Daniel Reyes. Brandon said he could barely swallow. His phone suddenly vibrated on the table, a startling noise in the tense quiet. He glanced at the screen and saw a text from a number he knew all too well. Jessica, his wife Stephanie's half-sister. It read, "I need to talk about Eric. I can't hide it anymore." Miller's gaze was sharp. "Who's that?" Brandon's heart sank. "My sister-in-law," he explained. "Jessica." Miller leaned in, reading the message over his shoulder. "Does she know what Eric is planning?" Miller asked urgently. "I have no idea," Brandon admitted. "We haven't been close since her dad passed away." Miller was already on his feet. "Call her. Tell her to meet you now." "Where?" Brandon asked, his mind racing. "We'll send a car. Just tell her to wait at her apartment. Don't say anything else." His hands were trembling so badly he could hardly type the words. "Where are you? We need to talk." He watched the 3 dots appear and disappear. Then her reply. "I'm at home. Please, Brandon, I'm so scared." By then, Agent Miller was on his own phone, issuing quiet but firm commands. "Send a team to Jessica Gray's address. Bring her to the Napa safe house. Unmarked vehicle, no lights." He ended the call and looked directly at Brandon. "We're taking you both somewhere secure. If she knows something, we need to get it before Eric figures out the net is closing." Brandon described how 2 hours later, they were in a nondescript ranch house miles outside of Napa, surrounded by nothing but fields and a single dirt road. The place felt sterile, beige walls, functional furniture, and heavy curtains blocking out the world. 2 agents he didn't know stood guard. He told me his anxiety was peaking when an unmarked sedan finally pulled up, with Jessica in the back. When she got out, he said he almost didn't recognize her. She seemed to have shrunk. Her face was a pale mask, and her eyes were puffy and red. She was just wearing jeans and a big sweater, a shadow of the person he remembered. "Brandon," she whispered, her voice catching when she saw him. He couldn't bring himself to move or speak. Agent Miller simply gestured to the dining table. "Miss Gray, please have a seat." Jessica sat across from him, her hands twisting in her lap. The silence stretched on until she finally broke, the words spilling out. "I owe Eric money," she choked out. $150,000? I borrowed it back in 2021 for a real estate business. It failed a year later." Tears were now streaming down her cheeks. "He threatened me. He said he'd report me to the IRS if I didn't pay him back. I lied on the loan application about my income. It's a felony. He told me I'd go to prison for 5 years." Her eyes finally met Brandon's, full of shame. "And he made me spy on you and Stephanie for 2 years. He wanted your schedules, who you talked to, everything. He wanted to know everything you were doing." "I didn't want to, Brandon, I swear, but I was terrified." Agent Miller cut in, his voice steady. "Last night. Did Eric contact you?" Jessica nodded, wiping her face. "He called around midnight. He said, 'Tomorrow night, 8 p.m., Highway 29, car accident. Keep your mouth shut, or you're going to prison right alongside me.'" She looked at Brandon, her voice shattering. I knew what he meant. "He was going to kill Stephanie," she sobbed. "And if I said a word, he would ruin my life." The only sound in the room was Jessica's quiet, desperate crying. Miller leaned forward. Miss Gray, you've just confessed to bank fraud, tax evasion, and obstruction of justice. You're looking at 10 to 15 years. Jessica's face went completely white, but Miller went on, his tone shifting slightly. However, if you cooperate fully, testify against Eric, and sign an agreement, the U.S. Attorney will recommend a significantly reduced sentence, 6 years, with parole eligibility after 4. Jessica just stared at him, stunned. You will serve time, Miller said, not unkindly. But you'll also be instrumental in taking down a very dangerous man. That has to count for something. Jessica turned to Brandon, her eyes pleading. Brandon, I'm so sorry. I know you can't forgive me, but I had to tell you. I couldn't let him hurt Stephanie. Brandon told me he felt nothing and everything at once. Part of him was screaming with rage for the fear she'd prolonged, but another, quieter part of him saw she was just another one of Eric's victims, trapped in a different way. Agent Miller slid a document across the table. This is the cooperation agreement. Read it, sign it, and then we go secure the evidence from your apartment. With a hand that shook violently, Jessica picked up the pen and signed her name. In our sessions, Brandon often came back to the smell of that safe house. Stale coffee and disinfectant, the smell of the beginning of the end of his nightmare. Miller and Davis were by the door, ready to go. It was 11:30 in the morning on October 17th. They were about to drive to Jessica's apartment to retrieve the proof that could lock Eric away for good. Jessica looked completely hollowed out, with deep, dark circles under her eyes. Her hands trembled as she put her coffee mug down. Brandon had spent the last 12 hours trying to absorb it all. Eric's murder plot, the confession of his associate, the criminal operation in his own home. And now this. His own sister-in-law, twisted up in Eric's campaign of threats and fear. Ready? Miller asked Jessica gently. She gave a small nod. Yeah, she whispered. Let's just get this over with. They split into 2 cars. Miller drove with Jessica and Brandon, while Davis followed behind. The 20-minute drive to her apartment was silent. She lived in a worn-out building on the edge of town, the kind of place with peeling paint and cracked asphalt that spoke of deferred maintenance and quiet struggles. When Jessica unlocked her door, Brandon saw an apartment that was tidy but deeply impersonal. It was filled with cheap furniture and a few lonely photos on the wall. It felt, he said, like a temporary holding place, not a home. The files are in my bedroom, she said, her voice barely audible as she led them down the hall. In her small bedroom, she knelt by a metal filing cabinet and pulled open a drawer, her fingers fumbling through the folders inside. Here, she said, handing a thick file to Miller. This is all of it. Miller began to carefully lay out the documents on her bed, one by one. Davis quickly set up a scanner on the dresser, also taking photos of each page with his phone. The first thing Brandon saw was a loan contract from March 15th, 2021, $150,000 at an 8% annual interest rate, with Jessica's signature right next to Eric's. Brandon told me his stomach clenched as he read it. Why did you need so much? He heard himself ask. Jessica wouldn't look at him. I wanted to start my own real estate company. I had a business plan, clients. I really thought it would work. But then the market turned in 2022, and it all just collapsed. She lost everything in less than a year. Miller pulled out the next sheet, a payment ledger in Jessica's handwriting. She'd managed to pay back $30,000 over 2 years, leaving a balance of $120,000. That's a huge amount to still be on the hook for, Davis commented quietly. I know, Jessica whispered. I tried. I was working 2 jobs, but he just kept adding fees, raising the interest. It was never enough. Brandon said the next pile of papers made his blood turn to ice. There were 37 printed emails from Eric's personal account, a timeline of terror from January 2022 to September 2024. Miller handed the first one to Brandon. The words were a punch to the gut. Jessica, you're 3 months behind. Pay by March or I'm reporting your tax fraud. You lied on your 2021 return. That's a felony. You're looking at a minimum of 5 years in prison. Don't test me, Eric. Brandon said his hands started to shake. He read email after email, and they were all the same. Brutal threats, impossible ultimatums, and detailed reminders of exactly how Eric planned to ruin her life if she didn't do what he said. He did this to you for 2 years, Brandon said, his voice a hoarse whisper. Jessica finally looked at him, fresh tears spilling down her face. I didn't know what else to do, Brandon. I couldn't go to the police. I just thought if I kept paying, he'd eventually leave me alone. But he never did. He always wanted more. Davis finished scanning the last document. This is airtight, he said to Miller. Financial coercion? Extortion? Blackmail? He weaponized her debt against her? Miller nodded grimly. He told Jessica, "You're a victim here, but you were also an accomplice through your silence. You enabled him. But the court will consider your cooperation. Signing the agreement was the right thing to do. That matters." Jessica wiped her face with her sleeve. I know I should have said something sooner. I was just so scared. I still am. Miller then produced a formal document from his own briefcase. He laid it on the bed. This finalizes your agreement to testify against Eric in exchange for the prosecutor's recommendation for a reduced sentence. Do you understand everything? Yes, Jessica said quietly. Sign here. When she took the pen this time, Brandon noticed her hand was perfectly steady. In my line of work, you hear stories that stay with you. Brandon's was one of them. He told me about the moment he saw his wife, Stephanie, truly free from her brother's influence for the first time. He described this awful vortex of emotions swirling inside him. White-hot rage at Eric for the manipulation, but also this deep, hollowing guilt. A guilt that he hadn't seen it, hadn't asked if she was okay, hadn't been the safe harbor she needed. I'm sorry, he'd whispered to her, the words escaping him. The apology just fell out of him. He said Stephanie looked up, her eyes puffy and confused. You're sorry. Brandon, I'm the one who... But he couldn't let her finish. I know, he'd said, his voice thick with emotion. But I should have seen something was off. I should have been a better husband. For a long moment, she just held his gaze, her eyes shimmering. Then, with a slow shake of her head, she let him off the hook. You couldn't have known, she'd told him. Eric made sure of that. In the background of this intensely personal moment, the FBI was at work. Agent Reed gathered the documents, handing a folder to his partner, Logan. We're done here. Let's get back to the safe house. As they left, Brandon told me he glanced back at his wife. She seemed diminished, he said, as if the sheer weight of the deception had physically crushed her. He wanted to promise her everything would be okay, but the words wouldn't come. Not then, because the truth, he admitted to me, was that he didn't know if he could ever fully trust her again. They got back to the FBI field office just after 2 in the afternoon. His head, he said, was a storm of revelations from Stephanie's apartment. The loan papers, the menacing emails, the whole tapestry of Eric's systematic abuse of trust. Agent Reed guided him into a small, sterile conference room where a large monitor dominated one wall. Logan was already plugging his laptop in, connecting it to the screen. "We have someone joining us on a video call," Reed explained, motioning for Brandon to take a seat. "Mr. Keller, he was your father's attorney." Brandon told me. The name felt like a physical blow. He remembered Mr. Keller from the handling of his father's estate back in 2020. A hazy memory of a tall man in his 60s with kind eyes and silver hair. He was the one who had guided Brandon through probate, explained the will, and made sure the transfers were smooth. Or so Brandon had believed for all those years. Logan tapped a few keys and the screen blinked to life, showing Mr. Keller in a classic New York law office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. He was wearing a navy suit, and his expression was grave. "Mr. Clark," he began, his voice clear through the speakers, "I'm relieved to see you are safe. Agent Reed has filled me in, Mr. Keller," Brandon managed to say, his voice strained. "I just don't get it. What is all this about?" The attorney leaned into the camera, his hands clasped on his desk. "I have something to show you. Information that should have been given to you 4 years ago. It concerns your father's will." Agent Reed silently passed Brandon a bottle of water. Brandon took a sip, trying to quiet the tremor in his hands. "In September of 2019, Mr. Keller continued, your father, Michael Clark, came to my office here in New York to draft his final will. He was incredibly clear about his intentions. The document was notarized by a licensed professional, Helen Ortiz, on September 1st, 2019. I am holding the original copy." He held a thick legal document up to the camera before setting it down. "The will stipulates that 60% of Ashford Vineyard, with an approximate value of $5.1 million, is to be inherited by his son, Brandon Clark. 40% of the vineyard, valued at about $3.4 million, is to be donated to St. Jude." "I just stared at the screen," Brandon told me, my brain refusing to compute. "Wait, St. Jude? That's not—" He trailed off, his throat constricting. "That's not what I was told." Mr. Keller's professional demeanor softened into something more like sympathy. "I'm aware. The will you were presented with in 2020 was a forgery." The room, Brandon said, felt like it was tilting on its axis. "Your father wanted to honor his late wife, your stepmother Sarah, who passed from cancer in 2015, Mr. Keller explained gently. St. Jude's was where she received care in her final months. Michael wanted to give back. It was his way of honoring her memory." Tears burned in Brandon's eyes as he recounted this part. He remembered Sarah's warmth, her patience, her constant smile. She had been more of a mother to him than his own had ever been. And his father's beautiful tribute to her had been erased. So what happened? Agent Reed's voice cut through Brandon's daze. Mr. Keller produced another document. "This is the will that was filed with the probate court in 2020. It's a near-perfect copy of the original," he said, "with one devastating change. St. Jude Children's Research Hospital is completely erased from the beneficiaries. Instead, 100% of the vineyard is directed to Brandon Clark." Logan magnified the image, and Brandon could see the subtle but profound alteration. "Who did this?" Brandon asked, his voice shaking with a fury he hadn't known he possessed. "Marla Hayes," Mr. Keller stated, his tone grim. "She was the attorney who handled the probate. I was out of the country for a family emergency, and she was listed as the secondary executor. I trusted her implicitly. That was my mistake. Agent Reed leaned back, his arms folded. Explain why taking St. Jude out of the picture was so important. Mr. Keller nodded. When a charity like St. Jude is a beneficiary, they are legally obligated to perform a rigorous audit of the estate. We're talking property appraisals, financial deep dives, tax reviews, physical inspections of every asset. If St. Jude had audited the vineyard back in 2020, he continued, they would have stumbled upon the counterfeit wine operation in the cellar within 2 weeks. It's a certainty. Brandon said he felt his stomach turn to ice. So, Marla forged the will to protect Eric. Precisely, Mr. Keller confirmed. By removing St. Jude, Marla guaranteed you'd inherit the entire vineyard with zero third-party oversight. No audit, no inspections, Brandon murmured, the pieces clicking into place. The counterfeit operation just keeps going. Logan was typing furiously, and Eric just keeps running the show under Brandon's nose. Not exactly, Mr. Keller corrected. The scheme was more insidious. Eric's primary goal was to pressure Brandon into selling the vineyard to a shell company, North Valley Agricultural Holdings. That company is a front for Nikolai Chichalov, he added. Had Brandon sold, he would have walked away with $5 million. Eric would have collected a $2 million commission, and the criminal enterprise would have continued under a new, protected owner. Everyone profits except for Brandon, who would have unknowingly laundered a criminal enterprise. But I said no, Brandon whispered, remembering the arguments. I wouldn't sell. Mr. Keller's eyes met his through the screen. And that is when Eric activated his plan B. Kill you, make it look like an accident, and then, as the grieving brother-in-law with ties to the business, facilitate the sale to Chichalov himself. Much cleaner. No arguments, no loose ends. Agent Reed rose and paced to the window, looking out over the city. So, the forgery wasn't just a cover-up. It was step one in a plan to give Brandon total control, making him a target Eric could either manipulate or simply remove. That is correct, Mr. Keller said. Brandon felt a wave of nausea. His entire inheritance, his father's legacy, was a lie. Marla Hayes hadn't just stolen from a children's hospital. She desecrated the memory of a woman he loved, all to shield Eric and his sprawling criminal network. What happens now? Brandon asked, his voice barely a whisper. Agent Reed turned back. We file the original will with the probate court. St. Jude's lawyers will initiate their audit of the vineyard. Huh? That's our official entry point, he continued. It exposes the counterfeit operation and proves Marla forged the legal documents. It's airtight. Mr. Keller nodded in agreement. I am sending you a PDF of the will and the notarized certification from Helen Ortiz. I've already spoken with St. Jude's legal team. They are prepared to act. Thank you, Brandon managed, though the words felt empty. Your father loved you very much, Brandon, Mr. Keller said with genuine compassion. He wanted you to be secure. I am profoundly sorry I wasn't there to prevent this. The call ended, leaving Brandon staring at the blank screen, the silence in the room deafening. Agent Reed put a firm hand on his shoulder. We're going to set this right, he said. Brandon could only nod, words failing him. All he could picture was his father, 4 years ago, sitting in that office, lovingly creating a tribute to Sarah, and how Eric, a man he'd once called family, had systematically burned it all to the ground. Logan shut his laptop with a soft click. Reed, forensics just messaged, he said. They're ready for the exhumation of Daniel Reyes's body tomorrow morning. Reed nodded grimly. Good. That's our next move. Brandon got to his feet, his legs feeling like they belonged to someone else. His world was coming apart piece by piece, and he had no idea how to even begin putting it back together. The Napa County Forensic Office had a sharp, sterile smell he tried not to identify. He and Agent Reed arrived at 4 in the afternoon. They were met by Dr. Emma Larson, a tall woman whose dark hair was streaked with gray and whose eyes held a weary kind of wisdom. Agent Reed, she greeted, shaking his hand. The exhumation is done. This way. She led them through a labyrinth of hallways to an examination room. There, under the glare of fluorescent lights, the skeletal remains of Daniel Reyes were laid out on a steel table. Brandon had never known the man, but he knew he'd left behind a wife and daughter. Eric had stolen their future. Dr. Larson snapped on a pair of latex gloves and gestured toward the skull. Daniel Reyes died September 23, 2022. The detective at the time, Hayes, ruled it an accidental fall from a ladder. He was mistaken. She pointed to 2 distinct, deep fractures at the back of the skull. These are blunt force trauma injuries, likely from something heavy like a crowbar. Note the angle. Both impacts came from above and behind. If Mr. Reyes had fallen off a ladder, the fractures would be frontal or to the side, and the pattern would be completely different. When Eric first sat in my office, he recounted the early days of the investigation with a chilling lack of emotion. He told me the medical examiner confirmed it was 2 precise strikes from behind. There were no defensive wounds, nothing to suggest Michael ever saw his attacker. He even recalled Dr. Larson's exact words to the agent. This was a murder, not some tragic accident. She then handed over a thick file that sealed Michael's fate, and, unknowingly, Eric's as well. He remembered leaving the morgue, the agent beside him, and seeing another agent waiting by an unmarked car. The man said, "Your father is at the office. He's asking for you." Eric confessed that what he felt wasn't fear, but a surge of profound annoyance. His father, Eddie, the man who had disappeared 2 years ago after a quiet life of obscurity, had decided to reappear at the worst possible time. 20 minutes later, they were in a small windowless room at the field office. He described his father, Eddie, as a man hunched over a table, looking like a husk of his former self. His hair was thinner, the lines on his face deeper, and his eyes were red and raw from what looked like days of crying. When Eddie saw him, he stumbled to his feet, knocking his chair over, and then just crumpled to his knees on the linoleum floor. "I'm so sorry," his father choked out, the words barely audible. "I should have told the police what I saw 2 years ago. That poor man's family deserves justice. I failed them. I failed you, son." Eric told me he just stood there, watching this pathetic display, feeling nothing but contempt. An agent gently helped Eddie back to his feet, telling him, "We need you to focus now, Eddie. Sit down." Eddie fell back into the chair, his hands trembling as he wiped his face. Brandon sat across from him, his own heart a steady, cold drum in his chest. From his worn jacket, his father pulled a small USB drive and pushed it across the table. "This was separate," he mumbled. "I didn't know if I'd ever have the courage to show this to anyone." The agent took the drive, plugged it into his laptop, and a single video file appeared on the screen. He pressed play. The video was shaky, filmed from a low angle as if hidden among the wine barrels in the cellar. The date stamp read September 25th, 2022, just 2 days after Michael's death. Eric stumbled into the frame, clearly intoxicated. His brother Kevin leaned against a crate with a smirk. Michael Reyes was a liability. Eric slurred on the screen. He cried like a little kid. Eric's voice echoed in the small room. Please think of my wife, my daughter. So pathetic. He let out a cold, empty laugh. Vance told me it was him or me. I picked me. Kevin's grin widened. What happens if Stephanie finds out? Eric's on-screen smile was predatory. I'll do the same thing to her. She's worth $3 million in life insurance. It's almost too easy. The video stopped, leaving a deafening silence. He knew the plan to kill his wife was his undoing. His father's warning, the evidence, it all pointed to him. But he told me that hearing the words come out of his own mouth, dripping with such casual cruelty, felt like watching a stranger. The agent closed the laptop and looked at his father. Why didn't Vance's people kill you? You were a witness? Eddie slowly shook his head. Eric never mentioned me to Vance. He was ashamed of me, his deadbeat dad working as a groundskeeper on his own wife's property. He told them I was just some temp. His father explained his system, using an old, untraceable phone to record and only ever entering the cellar at exactly 11:47 p.m. An agent looked up from a file. The camera's blind spot. Exactly, Eddie confirmed. 3 minutes every single night. The system goes down for maintenance. I timed it for months. Vance's organization had no clue I even existed until this very night. The agent nodded slowly. We found that glitch. It's been in their security software since 2020. They were too arrogant to ever fix it, the agent added. That's how you stayed a ghost. Eddie's hands were shaking again. I was a coward, he whispered. I saw Eric kill that man, but I was so scared of Vance and I was scared of my own son. So I just kept hitting record, praying someone else would put the pieces together. Then I heard him talking about pressuring Stephanie to sell the vineyard, and I knew he was coming for her next. That's when I finally did something. Eric described watching his wife, Stephanie, look at this old man who had carried 2 years of guilt, a man who risked everything to finally stop him. He expected her to scream, to be furious. Instead, she just looked tired. You saved my life, was all she said. Tears welled up in Eddie's eyes. But Michael's daughter, she'll never have her father again. That's on my soul. The lead agent stood up. Eddie, you're going to give a full testimony. Everything you recorded, everything you've said here becomes official evidence. Do you understand? Eddie just whispered. I know. I'm ready. The agent looked at his partner. Get this footage to the district attorney now, and I need to know everything about Marlo Hayes. Eric has someone else helping him. The other agent smiled grimly. On it. Stephanie stood up, her legs looking unsteady. Eric told me he watched his father look at her, his face a mess of regret. He knew in that moment she would never forgive his father, but she had the truth, and that was a hell of a lot more than Eric had ever given her. Eric would later be forced to watch the surveillance tapes from that night. He saw the cramped FBI van, smelling of stale coffee, parked with a perfect view of the Silverado Resort entrance. He watched the monitors showing the luxury hotel nestled in the Napa Hills, a place he knew well. It was 6 o'clock in the evening, and the setting sun painted the landscape in gold. Targets are mobile, an agent's voice said on the tape. Eric watched his own black Mercedes pull into the lot. He saw himself step out, straightening his suit, the picture of a man in complete control, never knowing his world was about to end. Then another vehicle, a silver Lexus, parked beside his. A woman emerged, tall and blonde, in her mid-40s, dressed in a sharp blazer and heels. She was the second piece of the puzzle that was about to be solved. "Marlo Hayes," an agent said on the recording. Eric watched himself on the screen, his eyes locked on her. In the video, he walked right up to Marlo. There was no handshake. Instead, he placed a hand on the small of her back, a possessive, intimate gesture as they walked into the hotel together. It was the touch of a lover, not a client. "Room 307, another agent's voice cut in. She booked it under a fake name and paid in cash. They've had a standing meeting here every other week for the last 6 months. Eric then heard the lead agent give the order over the radio. "Alpha Team, you are a go. Place the listening device and get out clean," the voice commanded. On another screen, he saw two men in hotel maintenance uniforms enter room 307. They were efficient, planting a tiny audio bug under a table in under 30 seconds before disappearing back into the hallway. The audio feed crackled to life in the van. A door opened, footsteps, and then Eric's own voice, crystal clear. "We have to be smart about this," he was saying. "Stephanie's been talking to the feds. They have my father's recordings." Marlo's voice was like ice. "Your father is a nobody. He's a drunk with zero credibility," Marlo continued calmly. "And the Michael case was officially closed 2 years ago. Warren made sure of that." Eric heard his own bitter laugh on the tape. "Your husband is certainly convenient." "Warren did what he was paid to," Marlo shot back. "He ruled it a workplace accident. No fuss. He's served his purpose." Detective Warren Hayes, Marlo's husband. He had taken Eric's money to bury a murder investigation, while his own wife was sleeping with the killer. There was a pause on the tape, the distinct sound of a wine bottle being opened. Eric had to watch the evidence of them planning his wife's murder over a glass of expensive Cabernet. "After tomorrow night, Stephanie will be out of the picture," Marlo said. "A tragic car accident on Highway 29. You inherit everything. We sell the vineyard to Vance for $8.5 million. I leave Warren, and we can finally be together." Eric laughed. "Vance gets his 30% cut first. Then we're gone." "Costa Rica just like we planned," he heard himself say. "New names, a new life." Then Marlo asked, "And what about Kevin and Quinn?" There was a long, chilling silence on the tape before Eric's voice returned, lower and darker than before. "They're collateral damage. If they make a sound, I'll frame them for Michael's murder. Vance's people already put their prints on the crowbar." He was talking about his own brother, Kevin, and his sister-in-law, Quinn. He was willing to send his own family to prison for life to protect himself. He'd used Kevin's debt and Quinn's loyalty to manipulate them, and this was how he planned to repay them, by utterly destroying their lives. The lead agent's voice on the tape was filled with disgust. "He's a genuine psychopath." Then came the sounds of movement, of rustling clothes. On the recording, Marlo's voice softened. "I love you." Eric's voice replied, "I love you too. After tomorrow, it will just be us. No more Stephanie, no more Warren, no more problems." The audio was cut. The raid happened minutes later. Eric told me he never saw it coming. He was so sure of his plan, so confident in his superiority, that the sight of armed agents crashing through the door was an impossibility he couldn't process. It shattered everything. Marlo wasn't just his lover. She was his co-conspirator in every sense. She had helped forge the documents. She helped him devise the murder plot. And she used her husband to cover their tracks. It was a conspiracy rooted in greed and betrayal. The final piece of evidence presented was Detective Warren Hayes's file. 32 years on the force, a decorated career, all thrown away for a payday. He was a decorated officer with a spotless record, which is where the tragedy always begins. I remember the agent asking, how much did Brandon pay him? An offshore account surfaced. $87,000 transferred to Eric just 2 days after Kevin's death. It was a payment for silence. The lead agent was clear. We need to bring Eric in for questioning. If his wife, Stephanie, was manipulating the investigation, we had to understand the scope of it. Did Eric even know about her affair? The agent I spoke to doubted it. Stephanie was playing a dangerous game, using her husband's position to cover for her lover, Brandon. They knew that when this all came out, Eric's career would be decimated. His marriage, his entire life, gone. The team's new mission was clear: investigate Eric Hayes. They needed to know what he knew, how much he was paid, and if Stephanie still had him under her thumb. The lead agent called his team to pull back from their primary surveillance. They had what they needed for now, but kept eyes on the main targets. They needed to track every move Brandon and Stephanie made. The agents on comms confirmed. I can only imagine the tension, watching the monitors, knowing that in a few hours, the two of them would leave that hotel room believing they were untouchable. But they had underestimated everyone. The federal team had recordings. They had all the evidence they needed. And the next day, their whole world was set to implode. What happens now? The target asked. The lead agent laid out the plan. We set a trap. Brandon plans to kill you on Highway 29 tomorrow, but we'll be waiting. When he makes his move, we'll have him. The other agent grinned, anticipating the resolution. She just nodded, her breathing unsteady. Tomorrow, it would all be over. But first on their list was Detective Eric Hayes. The Financial Crimes Unit was a hum of servers and keyboards, a stark contrast to the quiet devastation they were about to uncover in one man's life. It was 8 o'clock at night, long after most had left, but one analyst was deep in his work. The lead agent and the target stood over his shoulder, watching financial histories flash across the screen. Got him, the analyst said softly. Detective Eric Hayes, let's see what you've been trying to hide. A spreadsheet filled the monitor. The analyst highlighted a line in yellow. An offshore account, Cayman Islands, opened the same month Kevin Miller was killed. It had received $87,000 from a shell company. Brandon leaned closer. That shell company belonged to Petrov, the crime boss. The analyst simply nodded, and it wasn't a single payment. He pointed out 18 separate transactions over 2 years, all small amounts to fly under the radar. $87,000 in total. The target felt sick. For 2 years, Eric Hayes had been taking money from a monster. Every deposit was another link in the chain binding him to this conspiracy. But there was more. A second account, this one in Panama, held $120,000 from an unknown source. The agent asked if it was just unknown or deliberately hidden. It was hidden, routed through 3 countries. The person who set it up was a professional. But the analyst traced it back to another of Petrov's shell companies. The lead agent just shook his head. Eric wasn't just dirty. He was practically on Petrov's payroll. But why? Why would a cop with 32 years on the force risk everything? That's where Eric's story truly turned. The analyst pulled up a police report, an arrest record for Emma Hayes, his 19-year-old daughter, possession of 150 grams of cocaine with intent to distribute. Her mugshot showed a terrified young woman who looked so much like her father. She had his jawline, his serious expression. Eric's daughter. the lead agent said quietly. She was facing a felony, 5 to 10 years in federal prison. But then, as the analyst showed them, the case was dismissed. The file was dated just a month after her arrest. The cocaine had vanished from the police evidence locker. No trace, no investigation. With no evidence, the prosecutor's case fell apart, and Emma Hayes walked away clean. It was then they understood the terrible bargain Eric had made. Petrov made the evidence disappear. In return, Eric owed him an impossible debt. The analyst connected the final dots. When Kevin Miller was murdered a year later, Eric was the responding officer. He ruled it a workplace accident within 48 hours. No autopsy, no forensics, nothing. He shut the case down before anyone could look too closely. The lead agent's jaw was tight. Eric was Petrov's man on the inside. He'd been protecting him for 2 years. But what about his wife, Stephanie? Did she know? They pulled up their marriage certificate and financial records. It was difficult to say for sure. Their finances were largely separate, but one transfer stood out. Eric sent $20,000 to Stephanie's account the year after the cover-up. It could have been anything, the analyst admitted. A husband helping his wife, or something more. But the facts were damning. Stephanie forged a will, she was Brandon's lawyer and lover, and her husband, Eric, had covered up a murder connected to him. They were both trapped in this web. The target sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the layers of deceit. Brandon, Stephanie, Eric, Petrov. It was a knot of corruption and death, and it all centered on her family's vineyard. She asked about Emma, Eric's daughter. Was she involved? The analyst shook his head. There was no evidence of that. She was a biology student at UC Davis now, with a clean record since that arrest. From everything they could tell, she had no idea the price her father had paid for her freedom. The lead agent stared out at the city. Eric made a deal with the devil to save his daughter. I almost get it, he said. But that doesn't excuse a thing. He covered up a murder and took bribes. So what happens now? The target asked. The agent turned to her, his face like stone. We bring them all down tomorrow night. On Highway 29, Brandon thinks he's going to kill you in a staged car accident. But we'll be there waiting to arrest him when he makes his move, and Stephanie and Eric, all of them. The analyst stood up. It was a classic sting operation. Let Brandon think his plan is perfect. He drives you to the spot believing he's about to inherit everything. But the moment he acts, we move. A clean arrest with solid evidence. The agent looked at her. You're the bait, Chloe. Are you willing to do this? She thought of Kevin Miller, dead in her wine cellar. She thought of Mr. Peterson, who recorded evidence for 2 years out of sheer terror. She thought of Jessica, manipulated and afraid, and of her father, whose legacy was being destroyed. Yes, she said, I'm willing. The agent nodded. Good. Task 12. We planned the trap. Every detail had to be perfect. They only had one chance to get this right. The analyst grinned. This was going to be one hell of a night. She stood, her legs shaking. Tomorrow, it would all end. Brandon would try to kill her, and the FBI would be there. She just had to survive long enough to see him arrested. The tactical briefing room was cold, lit by harsh fluorescent lights. A dozen agents in dark suits sat around a large conference table, armed and focused. The lead agent stood at the head of the table, his expression intense. The analyst sat next to him, a map of the vineyard projected on the wall. The target, Chloe, sat near the back with Mr. Peterson. He looked frail in the harsh light, his hands trembling. This was the man who saw Brandon kill Kevin Miller. the man who spent 2 years gathering proof against his own son. Now he was there to help ensure justice was served. "Listen up," the lead agent commanded, his voice cutting through the room. "We get one shot. If we mess this up, Brandon walks, Chloe dies, and Petrov's entire operation continues. That is not an option. Understood?" "Yes, sir," they answered together. The agent pointed to the map. Ashford Vineyard, 50 acres, main house, wine cellar, stables. Tonight at 8 p.m., Brandon Clark will meet his wife, Chloe, in the cellar. He thinks she's selling the vineyard. He thinks he's finally won. What he doesn't know is that we'll be waiting for him. As a counselor, I've learned that trauma isn't just about what happened, but about the echoes it leaves behind. When Brandon first sat in my office, he started his story here, in a sterile FBI briefing room. He described watching a floor plan of their own wine cellar flash onto a screen, a place of memories now turned into a tactical map. He told me how Agent Miller explained the plan, that his wife, Stephanie, would have a microtransmitter in her coat button. "Audio and GPS," Brandon recalled the agent saying. "We'll hear everything and know her exact location." Then Miller held up a device, a simple thing that looked like a watch. "A panic button," he'd said. "One press and we breach in 10 seconds. No hesitation." Brandon remembered the words felt like ice in his veins. An agent asked what would happen if the target, Eric, found the wire. Miller's answer was chillingly practical. "She'll tell him it's for her own legal protection," he'd explained. "It's a plausible cover." Brandon told me all he could think was, plausible isn't the same as safe. He just had to hope Eric would buy it. But the fear that coiled in his gut was, what if he doesn't? He remembered asking Miller that, his voice barely a whisper. "Then she hits the panic button," Miller had said, his tone flat. "All business. We go in hard." For Brandon, that was the moment the floor dropped out. The entire plan hinged on needing Eric to talk, to confess on tape about Kevin Brooks, about the counterfeiting ring, about his plan to kill Stephanie. The more he talked, the longer she was in there with him. The next slide showed the deployment. 12 agents, 12 red dots surrounding his home. He described them to me, trying to find comfort in the numbers. Alpha team in the stables, Bravo team behind wine barrels, Charlie team on the roof of their house. It was a fortress, but Stephanie was going to be on the inside of the walls with him. Delta team would be at the vineyard entrance. An Echo team, with Agent Miller, was stationed in a command van half a mile away. Then, Miller had turned to him. Brandon recounted the quiet dread as the agent gave him his assignment. "You'll be in the tunnel," Miller told him. "Secret position 3, the one only you know. Stay hidden. If Eric or his man Mark goes into that tunnel, you get out. Do not engage." Brandon told me he just nodded, the word understood feeling like a betrayal of every instinct he had. His job was to hide while his wife's job was to keep a monster talking, to act scared, to seem cooperative, to draw out the confession they needed. "If he pulls a weapon," Miller had warned her, "if he even moves to hurt you, you hit that button. Don't be a hero." Brandon sat there, clenching his fists under the table, feeling anything but heroic. He remembered asking what would happen if Eric brought his associates, Jessica or Mark. Agent Miller tried to reassure him. "We're tracking all of them," he'd said. "Jessica's at her office, Mark is at his apartment, Mr. Petrov is at the Oakland docks. We have eyes on them 24/7. If they move, we'll know." Then Miller looked at his watch. "It's 10 o'clock. Stephanie, you need to call Eric now. Convince him you're ready to sell." Brandon described watching his wife pull out her phone. her bravery a stark contrast to the frantic pounding in his own chest. Miller handed her a script, a guide on how to sound broken. "Just hit the key points," the agent said. "You're exhausted. You can't handle the pressure. You're giving up." Eric needs to believe he's won. Brandon's voice cracked when he told me this part. He watched Stephanie dial, and on the second ring, a voice he knew all too well came through the speaker. "Stephanie," Eric said, his tone dripping with false concern. "Hey, sweetheart, you okay?" Brandon held his breath as Stephanie, her voice a perfect imitation of defeat, said, "Eric, you were right. I can't do this anymore. I can't run the vineyard by myself. It's too much." Brandon remembered the silence that followed, a beat of quiet triumph from the other end of the line. "What are you saying?" Eric asked. "I'm saying I'll sell. Bring the contract to the wine cellar. 8 o'clock tonight, I'll sign." Another pause. "Are you serious?" he pushed. Stephanie closed her eyes and with a voice full of manufactured despair, she said, "I'm sure." "I just want it to be over," she whispered. "I want everything to end." And Eric's voice softened, believing he'd finally broken her. "Okay, baby, that's good. I'll bring Jessica and Mark to witness. You're making the right choice." Brandon would never forget the last thing Eric said to her. "I love you, Stephanie." She couldn't answer. She just hung up. The room was deathly quiet. Brandon told me he could feel every agent's eyes on them. Miller finally broke the silence. "You did great," he said. He bought it. As Stephanie put the phone down, her hand shaking, Brandon reached out and squeezed her shoulder. "You're brave," he whispered, the words feeling utterly inadequate. "Braver than I ever was." As the agents began to move, checking their gear, their comms, their focus entirely on the mission, Agent Miller gave his final orders. "Tonight, we take down Eric Clark, Jessica Hayes, and their entire operation." But Brandon stayed seated, watching his wife, the center of his world, preparing to walk into the fire. Miller came over to her. "You can still back out," he offered. "No," Stephanie said, her voice firm. "I'm doing this." Brandon knew she was thinking of Kevin, of her father, of everyone Eric had hurt. Miller just nodded. As they left the briefing room, Brandon walking beside her, he spoke softly, making a promise. "When this is over," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I'm going to tell you everything about your dad, the man he was before all this." He saw tears well in her eyes as she nodded. They stepped into the sunlight, a world away from the darkness that was waiting. Across town, Eric was likely celebrating his victory, completely unaware that he wasn't walking into a business deal. He was walking into a trap, and Brandon's only role was to wait in the shadows, praying it would be enough. He told me that was the hardest part, the waiting, knowing that the woman he loved was about to face a killer, alone. He walked down into that cold, damp tunnel at exactly 8 o'clock. He remembered the feel of the stone, the smell of the earth. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm in the dark. The FBI earpiece was his only connection to her, a tiny lifeline. He could hear her breathing, the soft scuff of her shoes on the cellar floor. He was there, just a stone wall away, when she flipped on the lights. Through his earpiece, he heard everything, creating a vivid picture in his mind. He was blind, but he could see it all. He could see the rows of oak barrels, the bottles lining the walls, and he could feel her fear as if it were his own. He was crouched in the dark when he heard the footsteps on the stairs just 5 minutes later. 3 sets. He knew who they were. Eric first, his voice oozing a confident charm that made Brandon's blood run cold. Then Mark, nervous and twitchy. And finally Jessica, all business, carrying the briefcase that was supposed to seal the deal. Stephanie, Eric said, and Brandon flinched at the sound of his wife's name on Eric's lips. He heard the briefcase click open, the rustle of papers. Purchase and sale agreement, Jessica announced. $8.5 million. Brandon listened, helpless, as she slid the papers across the table. He heard Stephanie pick up the pen, and he pictured her hand shaking. He heard her set it back down. Before I sign, Stephanie's voice came through steady and clear. I need to ask you something, Eric. A pause. Why did you kill Kevin Brooks? The silence that followed was absolute. Brandon's heart stopped. He heard Jessica's sharp reply telling Stephanie to sign the papers. But Stephanie's focus was unwavering. I know everything, she said. The $47 million in counterfeit currency. Mr. Petrov? And your plan to kill me tonight? Brandon heard a rustle of fabric. He knew instinctively what it was. Eric's voice, when it came, was stripped of all warmth. He was holding a Glock 19. You're too smart for your own good, he said. Brandon's hand tightened on the shotgun he was holding. He was ready. Then came his signal. The low, grinding sound of the hidden panels sliding open. He stepped out of the passage, out of the darkness, leveling the shotgun directly at Eric. Put the gun down, son, Brandon said, his voice a low growl he didn't recognize as his own. He saw the shock on Eric's face. Dad, Eric whispered, a name he hadn't used in years. I told you to stop, Brandon said, his voice shaking with fury and grief. I begged you, but I won't let you kill her. Eric hesitated, his eyes darting between Brandon and Stephanie. Mark was already backing away, stammering, What the hell is going on? Brandon saw Jessica reach for her phone, and he shifted the barrel of the shotgun toward her. Don't, he warned. The air was thick, heavy with unspoken history and imminent violence. And then the world exploded. The cellar doors burst open. Agents swarmed in from every direction, a flood of tactical gear and focused intent. Dozens of red laser sights painted targets on Eric, Mark, and Jessica. A voice boomed through the chaos. FBI, drop your weapon! Hands in the air! In that moment, all Brandon could see was Stephanie, safe. From the moment Agent Miller's voice, amplified and unearthly, echoed through the cellar, Brandon told me it was like time just stopped. The Glock was still heavy in his hand, a cold, foreign object. For a split second, a desperate, wild part of him considered the impossible, but then his eyes registered the scene. A dozen federal agents, weapons raised, their faces set like stone. He let the gun go. It made a sharp, final sound on the floor. An agent yelled, "On your knees now!" Brandon described his knees hitting the cold ground, not with a sense of surrender, but of sheer, hollow disbelief. Beside him, Eric crumpled, his hands up, a mess of tears and broken sobs. But his wife, Stephanie, just stood there, her face a mask of ice, her lips a single hard line. 3 agents were on Brandon instantly, the cold bite of cuffs closing around his wrists. 2 others secured Eric. It was Agent Hayes who stepped up to cuff Stephanie, his voice a flat, procedural calm as he read them their rights. Brandon Ashford, you're under arrest. The list of charges, conspiracy, attempted murder, counterfeiting, washed over him. Words from a movie, not his life. He told me he didn't hear the rest. The right to remain silent, the warning, none of it registered. All he could do was stare at me, he'd said, and I knew he meant me, the person who had been his confidant through this. His eyes were just burning with a pain I've seen too many times. Eric was blubbering, a desperate litany of excuses. He made me do it, said Victor would kill me. One of the agents cut him off, dragging him up. Stephanie remained silent, a statue of betrayal as Hayes led her away. Agent Miller came over to Brandon, his expression shifting from tactical to human. You okay? Brandon managed a nod, but he felt like his legs were about to buckle. His friend, Mark, carefully set down the shotgun he'd been holding. He approached Brandon slowly, his own eyes filled with a weary, profound relief. It's over, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You're safe now. And that's when the dam broke. Brandon told me he just collapsed into Mark's arms, the sobs he'd been choking back for weeks finally erupting. Mark held him, a steady anchor in the storm. It's over, he said again. Outside, the sounds of car doors slamming and engines starting signaled the end of one nightmare. They were taking Brandon's wife, his friend, and his life as he knew it, away in separate cars. Agent Miller stood near the cellar entrance, speaking into his radio, organizing the chaos. Agent Hayes appeared at the top of the stairs and looked down at Brandon. Ashford, we need to move you. We've hit another snag. Wiping his eyes, Brandon looked up. Oh, what snag? Eric wants to cut a deal, Hayes said. He's talking, but he says there's something down in that tunnel we have to see. He claimed it could change everything. Agent Miller turned to Mark. Show us. Mark just nodded, grabbing a flashlight. Follow me. He walked to that hidden panel, the one he'd appeared from like a ghost, and pushed it open. A narrow, dark corridor stretched out before them. What's down there? Miller asked, his voice tight. Mark's face was grim. The real nerve center. If Victor Orlov finds out we're here, he can detonate the whole thing remotely. We have maybe 30 minutes. Miller exchanged a look with Hayes, his decision made in an instant. Then we move fast. We secure that tunnel and get Eric's statement. Let's move. Descending into that passage, Brandon felt the damp walls pressing in. He knew, deep down, that the last, ugliest secrets of his family's vineyard were waiting for him in the dark. He later saw his wife, Stephanie, cuffed and put into an armored van, her face pressed against the mesh, her eyes promising a hatred that would never fade. Eric was in another vehicle, still weeping. Stephanie was in a third, her expression as blank and cold as a winter sky. Brandon stood at the edge of his property, watching the dismantling of his life. Mark was right there beside him, a solid, reassuring hand on his shoulder, while Agent Miller barked orders into his radio about evidence and transport. Then, the world exploded. A massive fireball erupted from the wine cellar, shooting high into the night sky. The shockwave was a physical force, stealing the breath from Brandon's lungs as the ground bucked beneath him. Windows in the main house shattered. Stone, wood, and metal rained down everywhere. Get down! Mark yelled, tackling him to the ground and covering him with his own body as debris fell. Agents scrambled for cover behind their vehicles. Miller was crouched behind the command center, shielding his head. Hayes stumbled from a van, his laptop held tight to his chest, his eyes wide with disbelief. The sound of the blast rolled across the valley, a deep, tearing roar. When silence finally returned, it was filled with the crackle of flames and a sharp ringing in Brandon's ears. Mark helped him up. A small cut was bleeding on his forehead. Are you okay? Mark asked, his face pale. Brandon nodded, though his hands wouldn't stop shaking. The ringing in his ears felt permanent. Hayes was already back in the command van, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Miller ran over, yelling into his radio. "What in the hell was that?" he demanded. Hayes's face was illuminated by the screen's glow. "I've got it. Signal traced. Remote detonation from Oakland. Satellite phone." Miller's jaw tightened. Victor. He was sanitizing the site. The cellar was just gone. The place where Brandon's father had built a legacy, where he'd poured his own life and dreams, was now a smoking hole in the ground. The printing press, the $47 million in fake bills, the entire operation, vaporized. And then a scream came from one of the FBI vans. "I'll talk. I'll tell you everything." It was Eric. Two agents pulled the door open and he practically fell out, his body trembling uncontrollably. He dropped to his knees on the gravel, his hands still cuffed. "Please," he sobbed, "I don't want to die." "I'll tell you what you want to know." Agent Miller crouched in front of him. "Start talking." The words tumbled out of Eric, a frantic waterfall of fear. "Victor, tonight, Oakland Port, Dock 47, Container 7 Alpha, $200 million. He's loading a cargo ship. It leaves at 10:30. If he hits open water, he's gone." Miller checked his watch. 8:52 p.m., 1 hour and 38 minutes. He stood, grabbing his radio. "All units, converge on Oakland Port, Dock 47. Lethal force is authorized. Coast Guard, I want the bay sealed. Air support, wheels up now." The response was a surge of motion. Agents sprinted for their SUVs as engines roared to life. From somewhere over the hills, I heard the sound of helicopter blades beating the air. Agent Miller turned to Hayes. "Get me 50 agents at that dock. I want SWAT and a bomb squad. If Victor has more explosives, I want them neutralized." "On it," Hayes confirmed, already on his phone. Brandon told me he got to his feet, feeling unsteady but resolute. Mark helped him up. Blood was still trickling from his forehead, but he didn't feel it. He walked straight to Miller. "I'm coming with you," he said. Miller gave him a hard look. "Mr. Ashford?" "Don't call me that," Brandon cut in. "And it's not a request. He destroyed my home, my father's legacy. I want to be there when you take him down." Miller held his gaze for a long moment, then looked at Mark, who gave a slight nod. "Let him come. He's earned it." Miller sighed and gestured to an SUV. "Get in. But you stay in the vehicle during the breach. Understood?" "Understood," Brandon said. Hayes quickly bandaged the cut on his forehead. Then he and Mark got into the back of Miller's SUV. Hayes took the passenger seat, and Miller got behind the wheel. "Hold on," Miller said, and floored it. The SUV launched forward, tires spitting gravel. They tore down the long driveway and hit the main road, sirens screaming and lights flashing. An entire convoy of federal vehicles fell in behind them, black SUVs and armored vans. High above, 3 helicopters banked hard, turning west toward the distant lights of Oakland. Miller's radio crackled to life. "Coast Guard cutter steadfast and vigilant en route. ETA 15 minutes. We will establish a blockade at the mouth of the bay." "Copy that," Miller responded. "Do not let that ship leave U.S. waters." Brandon stared out the window as the dark hills flew by. Behind him, a plume of smoke marked what was left of his life. Everything he had fought to protect was gone. But Victor wasn't. Not yet. And he knew if they failed in the next 90 minutes, he would be gone forever. Mark reached over and squeezed his hand. "We'll get him," he said, his voice low and certain. Brandon just nodded, his jaw tight. "We have to." Miller's voice cut the tension. Task 15. Oakland Raid. This is it. We take down Victor, seize the shipment, and shut this down for good. The SUV ate up the miles, its headlights carving a path through the night. Up ahead, the lights of Oakland began to glitter against the dark water, and Brandon knew that somewhere in that maze of docks, the man who had stolen his life was waiting. 15 black SUVs entered the Oakland port at 9:30 p.m., moving like shadows with their headlights off. They threaded silently between mountains of stacked shipping containers. The air was thick with the smell of salt and diesel fuel. In the dark, the massive port cranes looked like sleeping giants under a blanket of distant stars. Miller drove with intense focus, his eyes scanning everything. Beside him, Hayes watched the live drone feeds. Brandon sat in the back with Mark, his hand gripping the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. In all my years as a counselor, I've found that the stories of a man's downfall often begin not with a bang, but with a quiet, chilling certainty. Brandon told me about that night at the docks many times. He described Dock 47, the colossal red shipping container suspended in the air like a guillotine. He spoke of the Russian, Eric Volkov, standing there, arms crossed, a business partner who represented the apex of his ambition. Brandon wasn't afraid. He saw Eric's men, their assault rifles glinting under the port lights, and felt a sense of validation, not dread. He'd built an empire that required such men, a world where power was overt and unquestioned. He told me that, as his SUV slowed to a stop a couple hundred yards away, he felt like a king surveying his domain, oblivious to the fact that his kingdom was already surrounded. He never saw the federal agents until it was too late. He'd later learn that more than 50 of them had silently taken their positions, a ghost army emerging from the labyrinth of steel containers. They had the bay locked down, cutters on the water, snipers and helicopters. The intricate world he controlled had been, without his knowledge, placed inside a cage. The part he always came back to was the detonator. His associate, a volatile young man named Leo, held a small black device that could have vaporized the entire pier. Brandon described a moment of cold clarity, the potential for total annihilation, resting in the trembling hand of a man he didn't fully trust. That, he said, was when the first crack appeared in his perfect facade. We spent hours talking about the moment he heard Agent Harris's voice boom across the dock. "Brandon Miller, you are surrounded." He said it felt profoundly impersonal, like a line from a movie he was watching instead of starring in. 50 agents, Coast Guard, helicopters, the sheer scale of the force arrayed against him was, in his mind, a testament to his own importance. He described looking up at the 3 helicopters, their searchlights carving through the dark and pinning him in a sterile white glare. He glanced at the water, at the military-grade cutters aimed at his ship. In that long, silent moment, he told me, he weighed his options not as a criminal, but as a CEO facing a hostile takeover. And so, he smiled. Brandon recounted this with a flicker of pride, a cold, strategic smile as he let his pistol clatter to the ground and raised his hands. To him, it wasn't a surrender. It was a calculated pivot. But Leo, his second in command, a man fueled by desperation, saw it only as a betrayal. He told me everything slowed down then. Leo's shout of defiance, the sight of his thumb pressing down on the detonator. Brandon was preparing for the end when a single sharp crack echoed through the night. He watched, mesmerized, as Leo's hand simply vanished in a spray of red. The little black box flew through the air and splashed into the bay, its threat extinguished. Leo was on his knees, screaming, trying to hold his ruined hand together. A voice crackled over a radio somewhere, confirming the sniper's shot. And with that, Brandon's carefully constructed world was breached. The agents surged forward, a wave of black tactical gear and shouted commands. Through it all, Brandon remained perfectly still. He felt a strange sense of calm as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. He didn't fight. He didn't speak. He had played the game, and he had lost. His guards dropped their weapons, and within a minute, his entire crew was neutralized on the asphalt. Agent Harris stood before him, listing the charges that would define the rest of his life: conspiracy, counterfeiting, terrorism. Brandon said he just stared back, his mind already calculating, already adapting to the new, confined reality of his situation. He watched them open the container, his masterpiece. Rows of boxes holding $200 million in perfect counterfeit currency. The lifeblood of his next chapter, now just evidence. He told me it felt like watching someone else's dream die. Then he saw her, his wife Stephanie, standing with her friend Michael behind the police line. As the agents pushed him into an armored van, their eyes met. He offered her a faint, unreadable smile. It was the last time he would see her as a free man. As the heavy door slammed shut, he could still hear Leo's screams from the ambulance. He knew his guards were being loaded into separate vans, his network methodically dismantled. Agent Harris's words, "It's over," were just a confirmation of what he already knew. He was certain his encrypted phone would be his undoing, and he was right. He'd later learn it contained everything: the blueprint of his operations, the record of his betrayals. It was the final piece that would seal his fate, connecting him to every crime, every co-conspirator. The 5 months that followed were, in his words, a slow, cold education in powerlessness. He, who had controlled so much, was now subject to the rigid schedule of the justice system. He knew Stephanie would have to testify, and he spent countless hours trying to imagine what she would say, how she would frame the story of their life together. He told me he was prepared for her testimony, for the confrontation. He saw her as a piece on the board he had failed to control, and he respected her for her strength. Her father, he admitted, would have been proud of the woman she had become, forged in the fire of his own deceit. When the day finally came, he looked out at the packed courtroom from a place of deep detachment. The trial wasn't the hard part. The hard part was the loss of control that had begun that night at Dock 47. The red container, its doors thrown open, had exposed more than just counterfeit money. It had exposed the hollowness at the center of his life. He described the courtroom scene to me with vivid detail. The reporters, the employees he barely recognized, and the family of Kevin Peterson, the man he'd had killed. He saw Kevin's widow, Jessica, and their 7-year-old daughter. He felt their eyes on him, but he told me he registered their pain as just another logistical detail of his downfall. 5 months. That's how long it had been since his world had shrunk to the size of a prison cell. He spoke of Judge Wallace entering the courtroom, a formidable woman who held his future in her hands, and how for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of something that might have been fear. They let him in, chained. He told me he refused to look at his wife, Stephanie. He kept his expression blank, a mask he had perfected over a lifetime. He saw his co-defendants, Carter, Dylan, Ashley, Chief O'Malley, each looking broken or defiant in their own way. And then there was Eric Volkov, as cold and composed as ever, treating his sentencing like an inconvenient but necessary business meeting. Brandon told me he felt a moment of kinship with the man. They were predators of a different breed. Now, caged together. The prosecutor, Ms. Albright, stood to read the charges. Brandon said he listened to the list as if it were an inventory of another man's life. United States versus Brandon Miller. It sounded so official, so final. First-degree murder, conspiracy, counterfeiting, money laundering. The words piled up, each one a stone sealing him into his tomb. He heard the names of his accomplices and the litany of their own crimes, a cascading series of betrayals and corruptions that had all started with him. When Ms. Albright requested the maximum sentence for all of them, he wasn't surprised. It was the only logical conclusion. He had built an enterprise of crime, and now the bill had come due. The court will hear the victim impact statement. Mrs. Miller, please approach. This, he admitted, was the moment he had truly dreaded. He watched his wife, Stephanie, walk to the podium, her hands shaking as she placed a piece of paper on the stand. He forced himself to stare straight ahead as her voice, trembling at first, filled the silent courtroom. She spoke of Kevin Peterson, the innocent man he had sacrificed without a second thought. She talked about his forgery of her father's will, how he tried to steal a legacy meant for a children's hospital. And then she spoke of his plan to kill her, describing it with a chilling clarity that pierced through his armor, as casually as if he were ordering a cup of coffee. He told me that when he heard her say those words, he finally saw himself through her eyes, not as a king or a strategist, but as a monster. And for the first time, he couldn't look away. As a counselor, you hear stories that stay with you. Brandon's is one of them. He told me about the day of the sentencing, how he watched Eric's widow, Jessica, crying silently with her daughter tucked into her side. He said, he just kept thinking, Eric Reynolds deserved so much better than this. He hoped his family could finally find some peace. When it was over, he told me his hands were shaking so badly he could barely stand, and he just collapsed into a seat next to Agent Miller. Brandon recalled the judge asking if any of the defendants wanted to speak. Mark's attorney started to rise, but Mark cut him off with a cold, "Sit down." The lawyer just sank back into his chair. After a heavy silence, the judge began. She looked directly at Mark Collins, Brandon's own cousin, and confirmed he'd been found guilty on all counts for the murder of Eric Reynolds and the conspiracy to commit the murder of Brandon's wife, Stephanie. I sentence you to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The words hung in the air, Brandon said. But Mark didn't even blink. His associate, Sterling Gray, was sentenced to 30 years, and he just crumbled, his head falling into his hands as he sobbed. Quinn Gray, his sister, got 6 years for cooperating with the feds. She'd be eligible for parole after 4. Brandon described how she just closed her eyes as tears streamed down her face. Another accomplice, Marlo Hayes, got 25 years and showed no emotion at all, just stared ahead. Her husband, Warren Hayes, got 18 years, and his face just crumpled in despair. Brandon thought he saw Warren mouth the words, "I'm sorry." But no sound came out. Then came the man behind it all, Nikolai Sokolov. For his vast criminal enterprise, he also received a sentence of life without parole. Brandon said Sokolov just gave a small, faint smile as if he expected it. The judge then announced that all seized assets, including $200 million in counterfeit cash and the $8.5 million from the attempted sale of their family company, would be turned over to St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, just as Brandon's father, Michael, had originally willed. Brandon told me he couldn't breathe for a second. His father's wish, after everything, was finally being honored. The judge's gavel struck once, the sound sealing their fate. The court was adjourned. As officers led them away, Mark walked right past Brandon without a single glance. Sterling was a wreck, still crying. Quinn, however, looked back and met Brandon's eyes, and he said in that one look, he saw a universe of regret. Then she was gone. The courtroom slowly began to clear out. He told me one of the hardest moments was when Jessica Reynolds, Eric's widow, approached him, holding her daughter's hand. She thanked him, her voice choked with tears, for making sure they didn't get away with it. He just held her, he said. Two people bound by a loss that should never have happened, just holding on. When she was gone, Agent Miller came over and put a hand on his shoulder. "Your father would be so proud, Brandon," he said. Brandon told me he just wiped his eyes and said, "It's over." But the agent shook his head. Not quite. He pulled out a folded paper explaining it was about the real will, about what his father truly wanted him to know. Brandon was confused. "What are you talking about?" he asked. Agent Miller just said, "The truth about your father's legacy. Let's go somewhere we can talk." And together, they walked out of that courthouse, away from the darkness of the past. But Brandon knew, even then, that one final truth was still waiting for him. The probate hearing a month later, in April of 2025, was a much quieter affair. Brandon described it as surreal. No media, just him, his wife Stephanie, Agent Miller, and a few lawyers in a small, formal courtroom in downtown San Francisco. The legal system was finally reaching its last page on his family's story. The attorney from New York, Mr. Keller, was there in person this time, looking sharp in a navy suit. In front of him on the table was the document at the center of everything: his father's true will, dated September 1st, 2019, the one they fought so hard to prove existed. The judge, a woman Brandon described as having kind eyes, reviewed the papers one last time. She looked up and declared his father's original will, the one dated 2019, as legally valid. The forgery was thrown out. The distribution of his father's estate would finally proceed as it was always meant to. She began to read from the will. 60% of the family company, valued at $5.1 million, to his son, Brandon Collins. 40%, valued at $3.4 million, to St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Brandon told me his throat just closed up. After all the pain, the lies, and the violence, his father's real legacy was being restored. The judge's gavel fell, the estate was settled. After court was adjourned, Mr. Keller came over and shook his hand. "Your father was a good man, Brandon. I'm sorry it took all this to make it right." Brandon thanked him for never giving up. An hour later, back at the FBI office, Agent Miller was setting up a video call on a large monitor for them. An image of a woman in her mid-40s wearing a white lab coat with a St. Jude logo appeared on the screen. Behind her, you could see cheerful murals on the walls of what was clearly a children's hospital. Brandon said you could faintly hear the sound of kids' voices in the background. "Mr. Collins," the woman began with a warm smile, "I'm Dr. Rebecca Allen from St. Jude. Thank you so much for speaking with us." Brandon said his own voice was tight with emotion when he replied. Dr. Allen's expression was one of deep empathy. "First," she said, "I just want to express how incredibly sorry we are for everything you and your family have endured. Your father's wish to honor his late wife, Sarah, was a remarkable act of love," she continued. "And we are so deeply honored to help carry on that legacy." She glanced down at her notes. The $3.4 million from your father's estate will be used to found the Michael Collins Pediatric Cancer Research Center, right here at St. Jude. It would be dedicated to funding research into the very diseases that took Brandon's mother's life. He told me he couldn't speak. He just nodded as tears filled his eyes. Dr. Allen went on to say they were also creating the Eric Reynolds Memorial Fund to honor the man who lost his life exposing the criminal operation. Eric's courage saved lives, she said, and we want to ensure his memory continues to do so. She smiled gently. To date, the fund in his name has already raised $2 million. With that money, we've provided life-saving treatment to 83 children. 83 families now have hope because of what Eric did. That was the moment Brandon truly broke. He covered his mouth, but the sobs came anyway. His wife, Stephanie, put her arm around him, holding him tight. He told me Dr. Allen just waited, her own eyes shining with tears. Last week, she said, once he'd composed himself, we had the ribbon cutting for the new research wing. Eric's widow, Jessica, and his daughter were there. They wanted me to pass on a message. Her voice trembled a little as she spoke. Jessica said, Eric always believed in doing what was right, no matter how hard it was. Brandon did the same. He gave my husband justice, and now my husband's name will save children. That's all they ever wanted. Brandon said he just lost it then, crying into Stephanie's shoulder. I watched Brandon stare at the screen, his shoulders finally unburdening themselves of a weight he'd carried for years. On the other side of the video call, Dr. Evans let the silence hang in the air, her own eyes shimmering with emotion before she spoke. She said, Brandon, your father loved you more than anything. He wanted his life's work to be about healing because you had the courage to chase down the truth. That's exactly what it will be. Eric Thompson's memory is safe now. So is Stephanie's. And we will never, ever forget what happened to Kevin. I saw Brandon nod, just once, a slow and heavy movement. Thank you, he rasped, his voice thick with everything he'd been holding back. This is what he would have wanted. It's the justice Kevin deserved. Dr. Evans smiled gently. Whenever you're ready, we would be honored to have you visit. The children would be so happy to meet you. I'd like that, Brandon said, a flicker of a genuine smile on his face. The screen went blank. Mark, his lawyer, leaned back, letting out a long, slow breath. It's over, Brandon. It's finally over. Agent Miller leaned back. That's it, Brandon. It's officially closed. The criminals were in prison, the operation was dismantled, and the funds were with St. Jude. He then handed Brandon a folder. One last thing. The FBI is returning ownership of your family's company to you and Stephanie. Brandon told me he just stared at the folder. For so long, the company had been a source of fear and betrayal. His cousin Mark had twisted it into a front for a criminal enterprise. It was stained with violence. His father's dream had been turned into a nightmare. But as Agent Miller spoke, Brandon realized it didn't have to stay that way. Your father built that company from the ground up, Brandon. It was his dream. It can be yours now, if you want it. Brandon looked at his wife, then back at the agent. What should I do? He asked. Miller smiled. I think you should rebuild it. Make it something new, something that honors your father, honors Eric, and builds a future for you. Brandon opened the folder, and for the first time in a very long time, he told me, he felt the unmistakable glimmer of hope. Okay, he said. Okay. I'm going to bring it back, Brandon said, his voice quiet but firm as he rose and shook Eric's hand. Good luck. You deserve this. After a nod to Logan, he and Mark walked out of the federal building and into the overwhelming brightness of the April morning. The drive back to Napa was a blur of green hills and grapevines rushing past his window. He told me later that in that moment he felt his father's dream was still out there, waiting for him to reclaim it. He wasn't doing it for Eric or for the syndicate, but for his dad, for Stephanie, for Daniel, and for himself. This was his new purpose, the revival of Clear Creek Vineyard. It was Christmas Eve, 2025, a full 8 months since the verdict, 8 months since he'd made that choice. I remember him describing how he stood on the ridge overlooking Clear Creek, watching the sunset. The land was almost a stranger to him now, scrubbed clean of the violence and deceit, reborn into something full of promise. The old cellar, where Eric had run his counterfeiting ring, was completely gone. A new 2-story building stood there now, all floor-to-ceiling glass and warm, reclaimed wood. The ground floor was now the Prohibition History Archive, a small museum he'd curated about Napa's bootlegging era. It was filled with old photos, maps of smuggling routes, and the stories of those who kept wine culture alive. It drew people from all over. The top floor was a climate-controlled vault, safekeeping bottles from local wineries, including their very own. But the real soul of the new vineyard was the tasting room he built to honor Daniel's memory. He walked me through it in his mind, describing how he'd flip on the lights and the whole space would just glow. With glass walls showing off the timber frame and soft Edison bulbs overhead, it felt more like a sanctuary. On the main wall was a large picture of Daniel Reyes, smiling in his work clothes, out among the vines. Beneath it, a simple bronze plaque read, Daniel Reyes, 1994 to 2022. His courage exposed evil. His memory inspires hope. Next to the portrait, he'd framed the articles about the trial, a commendation from the FBI, and a handwritten thank you from Daniel's mother and sister. People would stand there for a long time, quietly reading, understanding the depth of what he'd lost and what he'd stood for. He remembered the door creaking open behind him. It was Mark, holding 2 wine glasses. He looked like a new man, the color back in his face, his hands steady. 11 years sober, and he never wavered. You ready? Mark had asked. Brandon smiled, a real smile. Yeah. They had brought on a young couple, Wyatt and Isla Bennett, both 28 and fresh out of UC Davis with degrees in viticulture. They were the vineyard's new lifeblood, handling production and marketing with an infectious energy. Wyatt was a natural at blending, and Isla had a knack for getting their small batch wines noticed. This place was no longer Eric's criminal front. It was something better, honest, sustainable, and part of a community. That past June, Brandon and Mark had flown to County Cork in Ireland, where his father's family was from. They spent days exploring ancient churches and quiet, overgrown cemeteries, piecing together 200 years of their family history. On a cliff overlooking the Atlantic, they held a small service for his father, letting wildflowers scatter on the wind. It was the closure he'd been searching for. When they returned, they planted a California coastal redwood near the tasting room, a living tribute to Daniel. The tree was still small then, maybe 6 feet tall, but he thought about how it would stand there for centuries. At its base, they'd set a bronze marker with Daniel's name and dates. That night, he and Mark walked onto the main house's front porch. The air was cold and sharp, scented with pine and the smoke from a distant chimney. Christmas lights glowed along the eaves, a warm gold against the evening sky. Mark put the glasses on a little table between two rocking chairs, then theatrically produced a bottle from behind his back. Chateau Margaux, 1996, bottle number 217. The exact one that had unlocked the secret passage all those months ago. Brandon had to laugh. You kept it. The Bureau returned it as evidence, Mark said with a grin. Felt like it earned a better story. He expertly uncorked it, pouring the dark crimson wine into the glasses where it shimmered like liquid rubies in the light. Brandon lifted his glass, and Mark mirrored him. To Daniel, Brandon said, his voice thick with emotion. To my father. To Justice. Mark nodded slowly. And to second chances? The clink of their glasses was the only sound in the peaceful night. He took a sip. The wine was incredible, complex, smooth, and perfect, having aged for nearly 30 years, much like the secrets it once helped hide. They settled into the rocking chairs, sitting together in comfortable silence, gazing out at the vineyard. The vines marched in perfect, dormant rows down the hill, their bare arms stark against the last light. In the distance, the little redwoods swayed in the breeze. As stars pricked the deep blue canvas above, Mark spoke quietly. You did a good thing here, kid. Your dad would be so proud. Brandon felt that familiar tightness in his throat. I hope so. I know so, Mark said. They just sat, sipping the wine as the darkness settled completely. The vineyard was breathing again, not with fear and crime, but with memory, hope, and a quiet kind of love. I often think of that image he painted for me. The two men on the porch, the glowing lights, the steadfast redwood promising a future. When Brandon first came to see me, the betrayal he'd suffered at the hands of family had hollowed him out. A wound from a loved one, he said, cuts deeper than any stranger's knife. He was consumed by his past, by a thirst for a certain kind of revenge that he thought was justice. But through our work, he came to see a different path forward. It wasn't about forgetting. It was about finding the strength to build something new from the wreckage. Mark's steadfast friendship was an anchor in that storm, a reminder of what true loyalty looked like. The scars from that betrayal will likely always be there, a quiet reminder of what he endured. The impulse for bitterness can still flare up, but he chose to pour his energy into creation, not destruction. He chose justice, and then he chose healing. His story is a powerful lesson. You don't have to wait for tragedy to force a reckoning. If something feels wrong in your own family, in your own life, trust that feeling. Don't let silence make you a party to your own pain. What Brandon learned is that forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook. It's about refusing to let their actions define your future. He was robbed of his trust, but he refused to let them rob him of his life. Every sunrise over that vineyard is proof of that. If his journey resonates with you, I hope you find solace in it. We've all faced betrayal in some form, and the path to overcoming it is unique for each of us. I'm sharing this story with his full permission as a testament to the power of resilience, justice, and redemption. Thank you for taking the time to listen. The stories I share here are based on real experiences, but details are always changed to protect the privacy of those involved. My goal is simply to offer insight and hope. If this material isn't right for you, I encourage you to find content that better serves your needs.